Sweet. And now we welcome you to episode 29 of Agent Smith. Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Have you had a good week?
A crushingly good week.
Oh, good.
Yeah. We got lots of kind of lucky breaks where we got more exposure. I got to be on what is basically the biggest talk show in StarCraft streams right now with Artosis. So that was really awesome. And then I was in the StarCraft launcher yesterday for a class that I did.
Oh, yeah, I saw you post that on Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thanks. I did better this time. It's kind of interesting the way that you experience something like that as a human, because I think there's the desire to expand your brand and to get noticed and to get famous, but it also comes with more of the nerves of having a bigger audience and the pressure of wanting to really create something really good, as opposed to now if I fuck up, more people will see it kind of a thing. So I think I did a better job this time than my previous class. My previous one, it was the same format where I'm in the launcher, I have my notes, I do the class, but I was really hyped up and I was rushing a little bit. Like my cadence was faster than it needed to be. So this one I went into it, I took it at a slow, measured pace. Kukio was really good at that. He set a good example for a good measured level of speaking, even though he's really like sharp and fast and he could talk really fast. He wanted to make sure that the person he's talking to doesn't miss anything. So I kind of took that same approach, and I think it was definitely for the better. Because we have a lot of English second language viewers as well, and if you're just going on as fast as you can, they're going to miss a lot of stuff. So that was a really good kind of step forward. Today we did casting analysis and stuff. Have you had anything noteworthy going on? I know we had last week off.
Oh, I haven't been doing anything. You mean in terms of news and whatnot?
Well, sure, if you're not doing anything out of the ordinary. I told people you're probably furiously reviewing papers for graduate students and learning about the world. That was my guess.
I don't know, just kind of reading and podcast research, and went to an Indian wedding. That was exciting. But other than that, nothing particularly out of the usual. I'm a very much a creature of routine. I don't lead a very exciting life.
Well, some people think that exciting is drinking too much and then being sick the next morning, which I feel like not everyone wants to endure that kind of existence. But yeah, so since we didn't have a session last week because I was out of town, there's probably a bit more to discuss. I know the Korea situation is always one that is kind of worth addressing, I guess, just by virtue of how much people end up hearing about it. From my perspective, this is what I've kind of gathered from it, is it seems like there's interest in North and South Korea kind of making progress and working together and stuff. And then there's some kind of game theory fuckery mind games between the US and North Korea of being like, I wanna make good with you and I want us to have a great relationship and all this, and being like, I'm just kidding, fuck you, fuck off, like we're never gonna work with you, you're terrible. And then it's like, oh, I was just kidding, baby, it's fine, and it seems silly, and it's kind of like, what is the benefit of this? Are you just trying to make sure they don't trust us too much, or what? What is happening with this strategy?
Yeah, there was I think the big example of that was over I think it was this past week. Maybe it was in the previous week, when I guess it was, who was it exactly? It was Donald Trump himself, I guess, who announced that the United States was pulling out of the summit and wasn't going to have it. And that was done in response to the North Koreans also having a change in tone. They themselves had been kind of buttering up to the United States government in sort of press releases and, communication by media, that kind of thing. And then once it looked like the summit was set to happen, they kind of started to rag a bit on certain U.S. officials. I think the specific example was Josh Bolton, because Josh Bolton used a somewhat poorly chosen set of words. He was trying to say that the model for the negotiations would resemble that resemble those of the negotiations that were taken regarding Libya's nuclear weapons program. Because in the early aughts, Muammar Gaddafi and his government entered into denuclearization negotiations with the West, and that led to the eventual successful end of the Libyan nuclear program. So that was kind of the model that Josh Bolton was trying to refer to, but that was sort of interpreted by the media and also by the North Korean government as referring more to the subsequent events to that negotiation, which of course refers to the Arab Spring in 2011, which engulfed Libya and helped cause the civil war there, the uprising, that eventually led to Muammar Gaddafi's death and the downfall of his government, which was of course supported by the West. The implication being that Josh Bolton was saying not that he wanted to have substantive denuclearization negotiations that were as successful as the Libyan model, but rather that he wanted to use the Libyan model in the sense that the West would get them to give up nuclear weapons and then support rebels to overthrow the government later. And so people were very upset about that, at least the North Korean government. I don't know if they really thought that's what he meant or if they purposely misinterpreted it so they could try to get some negotiating capital out of it. But they started to rag on Josh Bolton and started to make noise about maybe not having the summit, etc. And so then Donald Trump, of course, took that to the next level, as he frequently does, and just said, all right, well, summit's off then. You know, you're not negotiating in good faith. You don't really want to do this, so to hell with it. So the United States technically walked. Everybody was very surprised because, of course, Donald Trump did not really tell anybody beforehand that's what was going to happen. And so then the fallout from that has been that the North Korean government has kind of softened their tone a little bit and has come back to the negotiating table. I don't think the Trump administration is explicitly working with the South Korean government as far as a common negotiating strategy. The impression I got was that the South Korean government was as surprised as anybody when the Trump administration did that. But it does work to a degree. You know, North Korea does not resemble a normal negotiating partner in a diplomatic negotiation, so a certain amount of unusual strategy could be expected, and certainly the Trump administration brings that. So part of what's happening is a kind of good cop, bad cop routine. And again, I don't know if this is being done purposely or is just de facto what's happening, but the way the negotiations are kind of unveiling themselves, or kind of manifesting, is that the United States government kind of plays the bad cop and, you know, heaps on the pressure, and then the South Korean government plays the good cop and kind of comes in and says, look, they don't speak for us, we do want substantive negotiation. You know, this is something we want to do. And that's an effective strategy in part. Again, don't know if it's on purpose or not, but it's effective because it puts the North Korean government in an awkward position. Because on the one hand, there are a lot of U.S. forces in South Korea, but if the United States did do something to provoke the North Korean government, would the North Korean government really have a casus belli to attack the South Korean government if the South Korean government was opposed to unilateral American action? So in that case, we've talked a bit about this before, but if North Korea did act in that case against South Korea, that would alienate the South Korean government, deteriorate relations, and almost certainly remove any chance for a negotiated outcome to the dispute, which would not be good for the North Korean government because they can't win a war unless they have Chinese support. And it's not entirely clear whether or not they really have that, because Beijing, as we've talked about before, does not want the North Korean government to have a nuclear weapon. They probably do want the North Korean government to stay in power, but they don't want it to have nukes. That's as unnerving to Beijing as it is to anybody else. So because it's not entirely clear where China kind of sits on that, it really behooves them not to alienate the South Koreans too much. So this kind of hammer and anvil approach kind of pressures the North Korean government more into substantive negotiations. Again, it's anybody's guess whether or not these are actually going to be substantive negotiations. It's still not clear just what the North Korean government is going to ask for and just how serious they are about negotiating denuclearization. That remains to be seen. But thus far, I don't know that all of the heat that the Trump administration is getting is entirely deserved. Certainly, there's been some amateurism in the negotiations that's kind of manifested in some of the Sino-American trade negotiations. But as far as North Korea, the Trump approach seems to be more effective than previous administrations' approaches, which were more either to kind of ignore the issue or to just kind of let other actors kind of deal with the problem, or just basically to take a much softer but less direct approach.
Well, I think you talked about that some when Trump was getting into office, right? Where he's a more similar type of leader as Kim Jong-un, where it's like the strong leader where you're actively talking smack to other leaders and stuff, and you're not trying to smooth things over and be really buddy-buddy with other people and be gentle. It's kind of like, well, if you're going to talk shit, then I'm going to talk more shit. Kind of a thing, which I feel like is almost more speaking their language.
Well, it's tit for tat.
Yeah.
Previous administrations were not willing to go to that level. They wanted to take, basically their response to that was multilateral negotiations to try to get other neighboring countries to align with a common negotiating position in order to apply common pressure against the whatever country, in this case North Korea. But the Trump, of course, approach, the Trump administration approach is tit for tat. Whatever you do, we're going to do only harder. And like you say, that is more in the vein of negotiations, probably within those countries, certainly in the diplomacy of those countries, like North Korea. Principally North Korea, that's probably the only real example you can kind of do. Iran doesn't really quite fall into the same category. That's sort of a different dynamic, diplomatically speaking. Yeah, I think also an interesting dynamic there, and this is just kind of a side thought, a lot of the criticism of the Trump administration within the United States, as far as criticizing the Trump administration's approach to the negotiations, criticizing its sort of impromptu-ness, its sort of, I don't want to, creativity if it's done on purpose, randomness if not, whatever you want to call that. But those criticisms actually help enhance the credibility of the government's negotiating position. Because if the government doesn't really back its threat, doesn't really intend to back any threats it makes against North Korea, and the broader body politic in the United States knows that, then the North Korean government can kind of sense that in the media in the United States. If there's not a lot of criticism or fear of a potential conflict with North Korea, that kind of undermines any threats that Washington might send. Because there's a sense that, well, if the American people aren't really taking it seriously, why should we? Whereas with the Trump administration, all of this heat the government is taking because of a perceived probability of a conflict, the sense that the government is risking a conflict, if not seeking a conflict, that actually enhances the government's credibility because it makes it seem like they really might actually follow through on their threats. So in a sense, again, not saying it's on purpose, but to a degree, the Trump administration approach actually gives the U.S. government more credibility and hence gives them more power in negotiations with North Korea than previous governments have had. I think it's kind of what they used to call in the 70s madman theory. That's sort of what Nixon and Kissinger did in negotiations with the Soviets. They would have these arms summits, basically, and Kissinger would come in and say, Nixon is crazy, he's a rabid anti-communist, he wants to, directly confront the Soviet Union, if not a war. I don't want those things. I want much less, but if you want me to be able to help you out and, avoid these outcomes, you need to kind of deal with me and try to meet me halfway. And that was an effective negotiating tactic because that was kind of believed. That was a credible assessment of the Nixon himself. Whether or not it was actually true is debatable, but Nixon certainly went out of his way to try to convey that image. And that helped Kissinger kind of leverage that to be the kind of the good cop to Nixon's bad cop in negotiations. Let's see. So there was that was kind of the big headline thing that happened over the past couple weeks that people have been following. There's been a couple other little things, but I don't know how much people would be interested in them. We'll probably get into them later if we have time. Let's see, so there was some questions. Are the recent North Korean displays of peace/negotiation with U.S. and South Korea a good sign, or more so continued political posturing? They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, why not both?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of posturing going on, for sure. But again, that's just kind of the language of negotiations when you're dealing with strongman-type political leaders. You know, that's just sort of their peacocking-type method of communication. That's how they signal to each other. So I think it's a good sign in that it signals that there is an interest in negotiations, and that, you know, there probably will be a summit at some point. You know, my immediate assumption when the U.S. pulled out of the summit earlier was that it was just posturing, and that would probably end up going ahead anyway. And that's kind of been borne out by subsequent events. You know, still not completely sure, but it seems to be trending that way. So that's a positive signal in a sort of broader sense. The political posturing itself, you know, again, I don't know how much of that is strategic or how much is just a manifestation of the personalities of negotiators, but it seems to be working thus far. You know, final judgment will have to be reserved for whatever the ultimate outcome of the summit will be. So we'll see. But for now, I think things are in general moving in a positive direction. So I wouldn't worry too much on that count. Let's see. What do you think was the biggest mistake in history? There's been a lot of mistakes in history. It's hard to pick just one. The single biggest mistake in history. I don't know.
I think it depends on who you're rooting for to be successful and what you define as success. Because they're like, yeah. I think if you narrow it down, you can define some clear objectives. Like, if you have a kind of group that's trying to take over the world, well, you can define a clear win condition for them and then point out the mistakes in that. Like, an example that we've talked about before is Hitler's decision to push both the Eastern Front and the Western Front at the same time, which is pretty clearly a mistake for that agenda. But then Nazi Germany is seen as one of the greatest villains in history, so we're kind of cheering for them to lose, right? So yep. It's kind of tough to say what the mistake is. It depends on where you're looking from.
Yeah, perspective does count. Yeah, I mean, you could say economic mistakes, you could say political mistakes, social mistakes. It just depends on how you want to kind of define mistake, which is kind of a wishy-washy answer, I know, but it's kind of relevant. I don't know. If I had to pick one, I guess I would default to World War II, which is sort of the historical event I'm most familiar with. And probably something like Pearl Harbor, which was not... every mistake made in history was predicated on certain assumptions. And certain of those assumptions made sense within a certain context. You know, whatever a certain context of the people who made them, of the time period, you know, of certain other assumptions that were related. So in a sense, you know, one of the fun things about history is looking at mistakes and trying to understand how somebody could make that mistake. What was the context that made that mistake seem like a good idea at the time? And in Japan's case, there was a lot of rabid nationalists who kind of saw a chance, basically, for Japan to become a great imperial power, sort of in the European vein. You know, they saw European powers kind of on the decline, and with World War II happening, they saw a golden opportunity that might be once in a lifetime in order to really seize a lot of territory and become a great power. And so that sort of forms some of the context for the decision. So in a sense, they knew it was risky, but they thought that the potential gains were much greater than were sufficient to sort of justify it. And then another, I think, assumption at the time was that the United States was kind of a second-rate world power that didn't really care about projecting power overseas, and that the American people were not that interested in maintaining a large empire, you know, defending their territories in the Philippines and Asia, etc. Basically, there was a sense that the United States would not really want to fight a long, drawn-out conflict in order to try to take back any East Asian territories that it might lose in an early Japanese assault. So there was kind of a misreading of American culture and politics involved as well. To be fair, the United States had one of the smallest armies in the world at the time, And there was a lot of political dissent in the United States about whether or not the United States should be involved in World War II, which was already happening at the time, you know, by 1941. And so the Japanese kind of saw the disinterest in the U.S. body politic and kind of interpreted that as weakness. They kind of sensed blood from that and kind of interpreted that as a sign that it was a good time to strike. And then finally, I think another assumption, again, I'm not like a big expert on like early Japanese strategic decision making in the conflict. This is based off of the limited reading I've done. So, you know, if anybody in chat, maybe I'll make the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything we talk about on here. So if I say something stupid or dumb or wrong or biased or what have you, chat is encouraged to participate and post corrections and criticisms and whatnot. You know, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So please do participate on that count. You know, it is meant to be kind of more of an exchange. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it afterwards. So I'll see eventually whatever message you kind of send. So that's another sort of relevant factor here for the Japanese government before Pearl Harbor was that they believed that they wanted, at that point, they kind of decided that they were going to attack the British Empire and the Dutch Empire in sort of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, mostly for the raw resources, in particular oil. But they decided they were going to do that, and they assumed that if they did, then the United States would jump into the conflict, at least against Japan. They thought that the United States Navy would intervene and that they would have to fight the U.S. Navy. So the Japanese planners believed that by striking Pearl Harbor, they were just dealing with a problem they were inevitably going to have to deal with eventually anyway. You know, if you think you can't invade Southeast Asia and Indonesia without the U.S. becoming involved, you might as well strike first. That itself could be a misreading. It's hard to say. You know, again, there was a lot of isolationist sentiment in the United States at the time, so maybe if the Japanese had just attacked Southeast Asia and Indonesia, maybe the United States government under Roosevelt would not have had enough political support to kind of thrust the United States into the conflict and to help Britain and the Dutch against Japan. But on the other hand, maybe they would have. Maybe that would have kind of been enough. And in that case, the Japanese Navy has to deal with sort of the U.S. Navy coming from the east. And probably a large-scale naval battle at some place in the Central Pacific. Again, hard to say. You know, it was a risk, basically, and the Japanese government decided to handle it by just assuming that it would be a problem at some point and launching the preemptive attack. But all of those assumptions have problems and, you know, are kind of judgment calls, and ultimately most of them ended up being wrong or bad interpretations or bad gambles, and certainly it ended badly for Japan overall. So whatever they might have gained was lost, and, you know, it ended basically with Japan being thoroughly bombed in a long, thorough bombing campaign, kind of in the sort of later in the conflict. So most of Japan got flattened, and eventually Japan was separated from the raw resources it had conquered in China and Southeast Asia. That was due to the U.S. submarine force, which kind of did to Japan what the Germans had been trying to do to Britain, which is to use submarines to cut off their merchant shipping. It took the United States a long time to do it, though. American submarines were not nearly as good as U-boats, and they had particularly bad torpedoes, if I remember correctly. They tended to be very unreliable and just kind of fail, basically, which is not a very attractive feature for a torpedo. But I think by later in the war, by mid-late 44 and certainly 45, they'd kind of figured that out, and the U.S. submarine force was finally kind of having a dramatic effect. So economic strangulation and strategic bombing kind of brought down Japan at that point. Anyway, that's kind of a tangent. Basically, yeah, that would, if I had to pick a big mistake in history, that would be it. I don't know if that's the biggest mistake in history, but it's up there anyway.
Now you
Let's
fucked
see.
up.
Yeah, a common refrain in history. Can you tell us about why the Russian Empire fell? What was Lenin's role? Yes, I'm guessing this is Tsarist Russia and the Tsarist Empire, and not the. Sometimes people call the Soviet Union a kind of Russian Empire, or sort of Soviet Empire. But I'm assuming, given that you reference Lenin, that you mean the Tsarist Russian Empire. what caused the Russian Empire to fall? I mean, it was always kind of fundamentally weak in a lot of ways. I mean, there was a lot of, I think its heyday was kind of more the late 1700s and early 1800s. You know, the Russian Empire kind of had a substantial advantage in terms of just numbers, in terms of population then. And warfare during that particular time period leaned a lot more on just raw numbers. So in that sense, the Russian military was very powerful relative to neighboring European states, and was a major European player as a result. But after that, Russia very much lagged behind in terms of economic development. And as European nations industrialized, and as subsequent industrial revolutions happened, you know, the first one around sort of 1800, and then later on in the late 1800s, and then again sort of early 20th century. You know, in all of those time periods, Russia did not really experience, at least in full, the full effects of the economic transformation correspondent to industrialization. You know, Russia was kind of just starting to industrialize in the turn of the 20th century, and by the time World War I happened, the process was kind of still in its early stages. And the result of that is that Russia really could not quite compete with rival European countries, even though it had a vast advantage in manpower. The technological edge of Western European armies was so great that it kind of negated the Russian advantage. Certainly the Russian advantage was great enough to make the Germans, even on the eve of World War II, principally concerned even, about Russia's army. But as World War I showed, Russia was not really able to leverage its superior numbers in the conflict in a way that negated Germany's technological advantage. And in fact, Germany was basically able to defeat them in World War I and knock them out of the conflict. It was just bad logistics, a lack of heavy industry, you know, a lack of infrastructure. Just there was a lot of problems as far as Russia's modernization and the lack thereof, and that put them at a severe disadvantage. And then another problem, in addition to that, was the political tension caused by that nascent industrialization in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Russia's political system under the Tsars was very archaic, suffice to say. You know, it was an absolute monarchy of the old school, and it did not really tolerate dissent very much. And it's, you know, a classic example of what happens when you have an authoritarian government over a long period of time that overlaps with economic modernization and demands in turn for political modernization. The more dissidents and reformers are unable to achieve their goals, the more radicalized they become. So people in Russia who had originally wanted liberal democracy increasingly became disenchanted with the status quo, increasingly came to believe that the government would never reform willingly and that the only way to have political change under the Tsar was with radical methods, with extremist methodology and extremist ideology. And so Russia, in that sense, and specifically Russia's political culture, kind of became a petri dish for radicalized political ideologies. You know, the principal example being Bolshevism. You know, nihilism actually came from Russia, if I'm remembering correctly. You know, the idea of nihilism came from disenchanted Russian reformers in the late 19th century. So it kind of gives you an example. I mean, I hope that's accurate. I hope that I'm remembering that correctly. But if correct, that kind of gives you an idea of what can happen over the long term as an authoritarian government refuses to reform. And the Russia under the Tsars is, you know, a good example of that. And so when the country began to develop economically, you know, there were a lot more workers, urban workers in cities, who had more and more political aspirations. All the more so because conditions were generally pretty bad and for the working people in a lot of the cities. That's pretty normal early in the industrialization process. And the result was an immense amount of political tension that the political system could not resolve, could not handle. You know, the secret police under the Tsar could only do so much. And that added to the stress caused by World War I, in which, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Russian soldiers are being killed for an imperialist war that doesn't really seem to have a whole lot of point. You know, it's just sort of a vague notions of spheres of influence and protecting Serbia and this kind of thing. And, you know, for what? For the interest of the Tsar, for the interest of who? So at first that wasn't too much of a problem. Russian nationalism was enough to overcome any qualms about the conflict. But as the Russian leadership failed to deliver results, and as the casualties from the conflict mounted, the political pressure to either leave the conflict or to have substantial political change or something, to do something about the ongoing failure in the conflict, sort of merged with the pre-existing dissatisfaction with the Tsarist government to create a revolutionary force that the Tsar ultimately was not able to resist. And that is kind of where Lenin jumps in. Lenin had been cooling his heels in exile in Germany, I think, at the time, and the German government actually went out of their way to ship him back into Russia, I think in 1917, specifically because they were hoping he would cause some trouble. He may not have been the only one. He's generally the one that gets referenced. But I don't know how, just what other political figures, ideologues, malefactors, what have you, the Imperial German government may have shipped back in a similar vein. But Lenin was certainly their most successful such case, if indeed there were others. He went back to what I think St. Petersburg and helped organize some of the earliest, what would you call them, Soviet committees. Actually, that's what a Soviet is, in fact. Soviet is, if I'm remembering correctly, a Soviet is a workers' committee. So the early Soviets, quote-unquote, were actually workers' committees in individual cities. Now, again, if I'm wrong, please correct me on that in the chat. And so he formed some of the first Soviets after the, who would it be? The Tsar was overthrown in the February Revolution. I don't know how familiar a lot of people are with sort of the course of events that happened in Russia that led to the Soviet Union, but it wasn't that there was a Tsar and then the communists overthrew him and seized power. That's actually not what happened. What happened is that a number of different people of different political backgrounds, including communists, but also liberal reformers, conservatives, etc., all kind of combined due to a common dissatisfaction with the course of the war, dissatisfaction with the political system in general, the economy, just all manner of problems in the country. They all banded together to overthrow the Tsar, and that was called the February Revolution, and that resulted in a republic that was led by a guy named Kerensky. I think he was a lawyer, and he ended up being voted as head of the parliament, or the Duma, as it was called in Russia then, and I think it's still called that now. And the Kerensky government actually kept Russia in the war, which was pretty unpopular, but it was seen as kind of almost a matter of honor, since Russia had been fighting with its allies and didn't want to kind of hang them out to dry, and also didn't want to lose the war. Basically, they didn't want to just give up. There was a sense that they'd fought so much and so hard for so long that they needed to stick it out and try to get something out of it. Turned out to be a very bad strategy, because that just exacerbated political tensions in the country. And that sort of dissatisfaction with the war and the Kerensky government, as well as the inability to deliver further reforms fast enough, kind of opened a window to Lenin and the Soviets that were sort of under his nominal leadership to agitate the population and create enough dissatisfaction with the Kerensky government that they were able to stage a revolt. And that was the October Revolution, in which the Soviets, in conjunction with allies and amongst workers, social democrats, farmers, what have you, banded together to overthrow the Kerensky government and put in place the first Soviet government, basically the kernel of what would become the Soviet Union. And that, of course, sparked the Russian Civil War, which would last, I think, several years at least. I think it actually lasted like 5 or 6, but the last 2 were kind of mopping up operations. It was really, most of the fighting was in the first couple of years. And the Civil War saw the Soviet government nominally take the biggest cities. They had St. Petersburg, Moscow, etc. So they had kind of the industrial core of Russia. And they used that fact to kind of gain recognition as the de facto government of Russia, at least from the Germans. The Germans were quite happy to negotiate with them because the Soviets wanted to end the war. And that led to the famous Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which Russia gave up an immense amount of territory in Eastern Europe. The Ukraine, the Baltic states, a good chunk of Belarus, Polish Russia, all of that was given up as part of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And some of it was made into kind of independent puppet states by the Imperial German government, and some of it was annexed. And it wasn't entirely, I don't think the Germans really knew entirely what they wanted to do with all the land, because I don't think they really had a plan for that. I think that was more something they were going to deal with after the war. But regardless, it didn't last long, and so that a lot of that territory ended up in a kind of Mad Max state of anarchy and civil war of its own after the fact. Regardless, the Soviets agreed to the treaty, all that territory was given up, and nominally at that point Russia was out of the war. But then the whites, as they were called, the anti-communist forces, started to coalesce, form white armies, and started to kind of do battle with the Red Army, such as it was at the time, the militant wing of the Soviets. And that played out in mostly, I think, southern Russia, to a lesser degree in northwestern Russia and eastern Russia. And not a whole lot of fighting in Siberia. And there was a lot of weird stuff in that. I think the principal southern general was General Denikin. And he was, I think, a former officer in the Tsar's army. And he led a sort of motley coalition of, liberals, monarchists, reformers, social democrats, some anarchists, and not a few conscripts, people they basically just forced to fight. And that was sort of the motley white army of the south, the army of the Donbass, I think it was called, or something to that effect. And that was sort of more northern Caucasus, eastern Ukraine, Donbass region. And from that sort of base of operations, they tried to fight their way north to Moscow, in conjunction with sort of a white army based more in the east around the Ural Mountains that was led by a guy named Admiral Kolchak. And he was a particularly prominent figure, I think, among the whites. He was kind of a stern figure. He had a lot of leadership qualities, and in general, he was a kind of a recognizable face for the whites. And he pushed west from the Ural Mountains onto Moscow in conjunction with General Denikin. Nominally, there was also a force pushing east onto St. Petersburg from, I think it was Estonia, which at that time was technically independent. Basically, there was a white army led by a guy named General Yudenich, if I'm remembering correctly, and he took a lot of different people, Cossacks, basically the usual white army material, Cossacks, monarchists, reformers, anti-communists in general, and formed an army in Estonia. It was not an Estonian army, and the Estonian government was not entirely okay with it, but they were not in a position to do anything about it. And that white army formed on Estonian territory and then attacked St. Petersburg, or Leningrad, as I think they'd already renamed it. I think they renamed it pretty quickly. And Leningrad Soviets quickly formed armed militias, workers' militias, what have you, and managed to defend the city. But nominally, while the major thrusts were happening in the Donbass and the Ural Mountains, there was kind of this third prong happening sort of around St. Petersburg. And also there was the Allied intervention, which Russians love to complain about. That happened in, I think, 1917, 1918? And, no, it must have been like 1919, more in that realm. Basically, there was a French and British expeditionary force that landed in the far north of Russia, kind of around Murmansk, or Archangels. I don't remember which. Basically up there, and they kind of nominally intervened to try to help the whites overthrow the communists, which were perceived basically as left-wing extremists. There were leftists, there were social democrats, there were social revolutionaries, and then at the way extremist wing there were the Bolsheviks. And because the Bolsheviks were in power, they were seen as an implicit threat to not only Russia, but just to civilization in general. Kind of in the same way that Islamic State inspired a lot of opposition. Everybody involved in the Syrian civil war has different interests, perspectives, rivalries, but everybody agreed that the Islamic State had to go. So kind of in the same way, everybody agreed that the Bolsheviks were extremists who had to be dealt with a common front. Well, everybody except Imperial Germany, which wanted to keep Russia out of the war, at least for the moment. So the Allied intervention was nominally meant to kind of hold down that far northern territory and to keep the communists out, but it was never really well organized and never really had clear objectives. They did keep the communists out, but it never really had anything beyond that it intended to do. So they weren't able to really help substantively the white armies that were pushing on Soviet territory in the core of Russia, around Moscow and sort of that area. And so they ended up just basically leaving a year or so later, I think. Not a whole lot of substantive impact. And I think there actually was a Japanese and American expedition way in the Russian Far East. But that was not really a big center of fighting for the Russian Civil War, so it didn't really end up being relevant. I think the Japanese had a contingent sort of in Vladivostok, or kind of that area, Kamchatka, and a little bit in the areas that were near Manchuria. Which I think, at that point they'd taken Manchuria. It was because of the Japanese had beaten the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. And so Manchuria had been kind of a de facto Japanese territory, although it wasn't explicitly so at that time. That would have to wait until the 1930s. And from that base of power within Manchuria, the Japanese kind of sent their army to occupy bits of Russia's far east that were close to Manchuria. And then the Americans kind of came in after the fact and helped, send some soldiers to Vladivostok, some of the cities basically along the Pacific coast. I don't think they did much while they were there, though, and I don't think they were there very long. And that's to say nothing of the whole Czech Legion thing, which is a bizarre story in its own right. I guess I could tell that, since that's and people might find that interesting. Basically, Czechoslovakia, Czech people in general, were living under the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the Austrian government because of nascent nationalism. Nationalism was sort of the big ideology of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so Czech nationalists wanted more autonomy, they wanted more recognition for their language rights, education in their language, the usual nationalist type stuff that nationalists want. And because the Austrian government was not willing to give ground on some of those requests, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, not only amongst Czech nationalists, but also amongst other nationalists, like Hungarian nationalists, Slovenian nationalists, that whole set of Slavic nationalities there, and the Balkan states that were in Austria at the time. All of those nationalists were upset at the government. They were not particularly gung-ho about, going out and fighting for Austria in World War I. And so over the course of fighting, there were several thousands of Czech prisoners of war that were taken by the Russian government. And they were kind of cooling their heels in Russian prisoner of war camps when the Russian government had the idea of giving them the option of joining a kind of Czech Legion, basically an army comprised of Czech prisoners of war who had agreed to fight against Austria and Germany, with the implicit promise being that Russia would help them gain an independent state, an independent Czechia, after the war, if Russia were able to win. And there were several thousand of those prisoners of war who were willing to take up that offer. So the Czech Legion, this army of Czech soldiers, was trained, armed, and was kind of on its way to the Eastern Front to fight on the front when the revolution basically broke out and the government collapsed. And the result is that they ended up actually getting stranded in Siberia. And they didn't really entirely know what to do at that point, because basically they're just a bunch of armed foreigners in the middle of a country in the middle of a civil war, which is an awkward position to be in. So they used the fact that they did have an army kind of at their disposal to take control of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was a critical node of transportation and logistics. And they did that, one, so that they could have something to negotiate with, so that they could kind of bargain their way out of Russia if need be. But it was also done nominally because they didn't really recognize the Soviet government as the government of Russia. Rather, they kind of nominally recognized the whites as sort of representing amorphously the legitimate Russian government. And so when they started fighting against the Reds, the Czech Legion also started fighting against the Reds, and their contribution was to seize control of that railway. So for the early mid part of the Russian Civil War, if you wanted to use the Trans-Siberian Railway, it helped to speak Czech, because it was actually run by a Czech army that had just kind of popped out and participated in the Russian Civil War. That lasted up until the white effort collapsed around late 1919, 1920 or so, when the Soviets were able to really start beating back the white armies and taking large tracts of territory. And the long-term result there was that, let me think here. I think they had no real desire to just, once it became clear it was a losing effort, they didn't really want to stick around. And so they ended up negotiating with the Allies, I think, to evacuate them from Russia and to get them onto the Western Front to help the Allies there and to kind of fulfill their end of the bargain. And I think they ended up traveling east on the Trans-Siberian Railway to go to the Russian Far East. And I think it was there that American ships came and evacuated them and transported them across the Pacific to the United States, transported them across the United States to the eastern coast of the US, and then transported them across the Atlantic to Western Europe. And it was there that they were refitted, re-equipped, retrained, and then eventually I think they finally did end up fighting on the Western Front. But I think it was pretty late in the conflict, and I don't think they ended up fighting for very long. But that's sort of the story of the Czech Legion. They had sort of this weird, eccentric role to play in Russia's history. So let's see, that was kind of a tangent to the end of the Russian Empire question. So kind of to summarize, the end of the Russian Empire centered around Russia's economic weakness, its technological backwardness, its inability to kind of keep pace with the development of the rest of Europe, and as well as an inability to exhibit the kind of political flexibility necessary to manage the political tensions created by modernization, specifically economic modernization. All of those kind of played significant factors in Russia's eventual collapse in the early 20th century and its transformation at that point into the Soviet Union. If I'm missing something important, please contribute. I'm not a Russia expert. This is just what I'm remembering from what I've read. You know, and I might not even be remembering it correctly. So please do jump into chat, especially if you're Russian. If you're Russian, you've probably got some unique context here you can add.
I'm not a Russia expert. I'm not Russian. Please send help.
Yeah, pretty much. Let's see. Okay, next question was, I'm curious what you think of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, regarding the financial impact it'll have across the world and possible repercussions in the sense of how we view advertisements and data privacy. Yeah, I think I did have some notes on that even. So basically, let me get some water real quick.
Okay.
All right. Sorry. Yeah, there's a lot of firms, especially smaller firms, who are really concerned about it because they don't entirely know what enforcement is going to look like. So they don't know how strict it's going to be and the degree to which they'll have some flexibility. Like if you're a smaller firm and maybe you gather data in a way that you don't know is applicable, you know, that the GDPR applies to. Or maybe if you do gather data and you do take measures in compliance with the GDPR, but you're actually not doing it in a way that's in full compliance, but you're not aware of that. Cases like that, you know, just sort of ambiguous cases like that are of concern if you're a small business, because the fines they're talking about are very large, and if you're a small business, you might not be able to survive those kinds of things. Nominally, the European Union regulator responsible for enforcing it has said that they're going to focus on larger firms, so smaller businesses should not really particularly worry about it, but of course they do worry about it because the law still applies to them. So just saying, trust us, don't worry, isn't really good enough if you're a small business in Europe. So there's still a lot of concern there in terms of on the business side, basically. If you're a consumer, it's nice because then you have a little more certainty as far as who's gathering your data, what it's being used for, etc. I don't know how useful it's going to be in the long run because, you know, if you want a useful service, they'll probably ask you to give access to your data. And in that case, you know, you're kind of put in a bind. Do you want to give it up and have access to the service, or do you just want to forego the service? You know, but you don't really want to do either. Otherwise, why would you be looking into it in the first place? So I guess you could say you're creating a market for firms that want to use data in a way that people will like or comfortable with, and to give those firms an advantage. But whether or not that actually happens is kind of ambiguous at this point. It's not entirely clear what direction the industry will go in, and just what a long-term effect this legislation will have on Europe's tech community, tech sector. Generally, the bigger firms are the ones most able to comply. So while the law is technically intended more to regulate them, they're probably the ones who will be able to handle it best. So it's not really them people are concerned about. You know, maybe there will be a fine here and there, but they generally have enough money to kind of handle that. You know, the real question is what the long-term effect will be on the smaller businesses, you know, on small business creation. Will there be an effect there? Still too early to say, but there's potential. So that would be kind of something I would be looking at over the medium to long term. Something else I thought was interesting is that a lot of foreign firms are just kind of leaving the market, which is weird because I don't know how you do that on the internet. I think nominally they're supposed to be trying to block users, I think. There's a couple of firms, I think Pinterest was one, that's trying to block users in the European Union so that it doesn't have to comply with the GDPR. Specifically because it either doesn't, I don't remember what the logic was exactly. They don't want to incur the cost of compliance, or they didn't want to bother, or whatever it was. But there were some, I think mostly US firms basically, that were just exiting the market rather than deal with it. So that could have an interesting effect in which there's space created in the European market in which European substitutes could emerge. So in that sense, the GDPR is kind of protectionist policy. It's a way of kind of reducing competition in the European market, at least from foreign competition, in a way that could create more space for European equivalents. And given that there's been a lot of complaints in Europe over the past 10 years about, you know, quote-unquote monopolization by American tech firms of this, that, and the other tech niche of the tech sector, that would kind of dovetail nicely with European objectives in terms of trying to crack down on the market power of American tech companies and try to give more space and support to European tech companies to try to also grow large and powerful. I don't know enough about the tech sector and its dynamics to really kind of critique that, to know how efficacious that's going to be over the long term. It may be that it's not even really possible to do that. You know, it may be that if you're a European user and you want to use an American firm, you just find a go-around. You know, technically, some of these firms that are blocking European users probably would not care if a European user lied about where they were from by using a proxy server or something to get around the block. So that's pretty possible, and the internet is just rife with ways and to work around restrictions of one sort or another, so that would hardly be unusual. So basically, I guess in summary, my principal interest as far as GDPR is what the long-term effects will be. You know, short-term effects are pretty clear. There's a lot of consternation and uncertainty, but I would be curious what the long-term effects are on the health of the European tech sector, and whether the protectionist aspect enhances the European tech sector, or whether the restrictions are sufficiently stifling to kind of stifle the European tech sector writ large as well. Some of you listening probably have a significantly stronger background in the tech sector than I do, so your input on this count would be appreciated. I don't know, though, you ask regarding the financial impact it'll have across the world. I don't know that it'll have a huge impact across the world, because it's only firms that are doing business in Europe that are principally affected. And again, the bigger firms aren't going to be that affected. They can, you know, large firms can almost always afford regulations. And in fact, large firms often like regulations because it increases the barrier to entry into the industry. You know, if there's a lot of red tape involved with getting your business started and operating, and a lot of legal risk and a lot of other risks involved created by a regulatory regime, that just makes it more difficult to enter the industry, and that means less competition if you're an established player. So, you know, if you're Ford Motors or you're GM or if you're General Electric, you know, more regulation is always better. You know, you don't generally push actively for it because it hurts you as well. You know, it's money out of your pocket generally, but you don't really go too far out of your way against it. You know, and sometimes there are some regulations that you would even support because you know that you can handle it easily, but that a smaller competitor would not. So the big players will be fine. You know, again, as far as financial impact across the world, I guess even there, my curiosity would be mostly about small players, the smaller firms, because they're the ones who would have the most trouble kind of adhering to it, you know, complying with the policy and then dealing with any subsequent sanctions that might be applied.
I have a similar kind of overlap in my experience with the size of Twitch streams, where the smaller ones get the rules enforced against them much less than the larger ones. It's almost like if you're a small enough stream, many of the rules don't even apply. In the sense that it doesn't really impact the overall integrity of the Twitch product, so they don't really invest the resources in investigating stuff like that. But if you're a big stream, then stuff gets enforced immediately against you because you have like thousands and thousands of people seeing what's going on there.
Yeah, if you're small, you can kind of fly under the radar. And generally, you don't generate a whole lot of complaints, and without complaints, you generally don't get a lot of attention. Whereas the big firms will generate a lot more complaints, and so that gives regulators a lot more to focus on. It tends to dominate their attention a bit. Let's see, and the last part of the question was possible repercussions in the sense of how we view advertisement and data privacy. I don't know that it'll actually change anything on that count, because I think the GDPR itself reflects the European perspective of advertisement and data privacy, which is that data privacy is paramount and that technical firms should be regulated and should be restricted in how they gather data, or at least they should gather data in a very explicit, transparent way, rather than doing it implicitly, like happens in the rest of the world. The idea there being, do you implicitly agree to give your data whenever you just use a service? In the United States, the answer is yes. Nominally, that's in terms of service that nobody ever reads. Just by using a given service, you're agreeing to give your data. In Europe, though, the perspective is you should actively say, you should actually have to agree explicitly to share your data before a firm can take it. So the implicit model used in the United States and other places is not a model that is very attractive in Europe. And the GDPR reflects that. And I don't think it's going to change perceptions in Europe on that count unless it's particularly intrusive or destructive. And I also don't think it's going to change perspectives in the United States. Because I think the whole reason we have our regulatory regime here in the United States is because there is, in general, not universally, but in general, there is a balance of opinion that this model, the implicit model, is acceptable. Not everybody likes it, again, but there's enough people that are comfortable with it to make traction on potential reform difficult. There might be some minor reforms in the future, but I don't think it will be anything too dramatic that would really significantly change the significantly impact the operations of American tech firms. And I might add, there's also a kind of, what's it called? The name just flew right out of my head. Basically, the United States can benefit from Europe's regulation because it can kind of sell its lighter regulatory space. The United States can say, okay, the temptation, that's what it is, basically. There's a temptation to say now that, okay, maybe we would have had reform before, but because the Europeans have put in place these relatively strict regulations, that makes the US market much more attractive in comparison. And so there's a temptation to forego regulations that might have been engaged upon before because there is this potential benefit from not regulating more on account of the European action. So the Europeans, by being a first mover, give the United States an incentive to not regulate because it could basically steal European tech business. It could attract that tech business, poach it, if you will, to the United States market by using its more attractive regulatory regime. And the United States kind of has a long history of doing that. Being a country that is culturally and politically inclined to light regulation, the United States, both within American politics and in its sort of foreign relations, tends to design its policies in a way that is meant to poach talent like that. One of the big reasons the US economy kind of took off after World War II is because it attracted a lot of talent from Europe explicitly, but also other parts of the world who were looking to basically to live in a place that wasn't a war-torn wasteland. Europe was in bad shape after World War II, and there were a lot of people that wanted a place to go, that needed a place to go. And a good chunk of them ended up coming to the United States because there was a lot of work here, there was good pay, and things were pretty stable. The United States was relatively untouched by the conflict, so pretty quiet and attractive in that sense. So similarly, there might be a similar temptation to engage in similar poaching type behavior as far as the design of regulations, tech regulations. I say within the United States too, because there's a lot of policy competition amongst individual U.S. states in order to give the best local incentives for companies to relocate to their state. So states will give tax credits, tax incentives, basically little subsidies here and there to try to get businesses to come to a given state. A big example of that is the film industry. It used to be most of the film industry was in California. But over the past 50 years, a lot of other states have started up tax programs to try to give tax breaks to incentivize film production companies to do filming in this, that, or the other state, in their state, basically, to try to create a nascent film industry in the state. So Georgia, I think, is kind of the big example of that, because a lot of, I think, The Walking Dead is actually filmed in Georgia for that reason. And so there's other examples, but I think Atlanta and Georgia is sort of one of the more prominent ones. Let's see. I think I pretty well covered that, but if I missed something important, let me know. Again, most of you listening probably have stronger backgrounds in tech than I do, so if I'm missing a key element, please do pipe up in chat, or ask me a question that kind of elaborates the point. Let's see, the next question was, what are your thoughts on Australia leveling an accusation at Russia over the Malaysian flight MH17, what might Australia be trying to achieve, and what obligation, if any, is there for Russia to acknowledge these claims? I think there was a finding recently from a UN panel of some kind that found that it was a UN investigatory thing of some kind, and they found that the missile used, supposedly, they conclude that the missile used to destroy MH17. I think this is the flight over the Ukraine, if I'm remembering correctly, not the one that was that disappeared in the Indian Ocean. The finding was that the missile supposedly used to destroy the aircraft was one that was used by a Russian missile defense unit in Russia that may or may not have been deployed in Ukraine at the time. And so I haven't heard specifically about an Australian accusation, but I have heard that UN finding. So I would imagine the Australian government is just following up on that. I think there was a number of other states that also kind of used it to level some accusations against Russia on that count. What might Australia be trying to achieve? They're not really trying to achieve anything. I don't think Australia, and the Australian government specifically, has any delusions about its ability to sway world events. So generally when Australia engages in international politics, they're doing so as part of a coalition. So Australian foreign policy is generally tied to the foreign policy of the United States, the United Kingdom, sometimes Europe generally, basically whatever kind of other coalition that they're trying to join up with. Because Australia by itself doesn't have the economic heft, the military heft, the political heft to really push its preferences on the world arena. It kind of has to have allies to work with in order to really achieve international objectives. So if they're critiquing Russia with regard to MH17 because of this UN finding I'm referring to, they're probably just doing it because that's sort of the common line that they're trying to take with allied nations. And by taking that common line, they're kind of expecting in return that those allied nations will help Australia later if there was some international issue that pops up at some point that's specific to Australia and East Asia. And then what obligation, if any, is there for Russia to acknowledge these claims? None whatsoever, because international law is kind of wishy-washy and amorphous. It's not really a hard requirement that you obey international law. It's more obey it when you want, when it's convenient, and if not, then you can just kind of ignore it without substantive consequence.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. If you don't abide these international laws, then we will be very upset with you.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. You know, if the laws are ignored, then hypothetically, a state or a coalition of states could levy sanctions against you. But odds are, if they were going to levy sanctions over something you did that ignored international law, they were probably going to do it anyway. So in that sense, international law is not that important. It's kind of more of a symbolic entity at this point. Nominally, weaker nations tend to embrace it more because they want international law to act as a brake on stronger nations to prevent them from using their greater strength as leverage in order to coerce them into doing things they wouldn't want to do otherwise. But generally, the degree to which they can do that is pretty limited, and the degree to which stronger nations adhere to international law is generally very conditional. It depends on the individual government in power, it depends on foreign policy objectives, it depends on the context of international issues in a given period of time. It's not hard and fast. There's not really any world police that can stop a powerful country from ignoring the law in that way. So international issues vis-a-vis international law violations are not really about international law violators versus the international system of law. It's really about international law violators versus individual powerful countries that have an issue with them. Like Russia and China don't necessarily care a whole lot that Iran is violating certain provisions of international law by supporting Hamas or engaging or supporting, you know, radical elements in this, that, or the other country, or trying to develop a nuclear weapon. Really, the United States and Europe are more bothered by those things. And so the lead on putting pressure on Iran for those violations comes from the United States and Europe, and then Russia and China just kind of go along sometimes, depending on circumstances. So there's not really any obligation for Russia to respond. I don't think they will. They generally don't. They can afford to just ignore them and to kind of carry on as usual. Yeah, it really doesn't matter if Russia shot down the plane or not if you're a representative in the Russian government. You're always going to deny it. And there's really nobody who can bring enough pressure to bear on Russia to force you to do otherwise. So that's probably going to continue to be the case going forward. I don't think the Russian government's position is going to change as a result of this. Let's see. Tyrant Stalin, myth or truth? Was he a good or bad leader, or why? Well, to a degree that's subjective, because how you define the traits that constitute good leadership kind of vary from person to person. I know in Russia a lot of people think of Stalin as a strong leader, and because a lot of Russians define good leadership as strong leadership, Stalin is in turn defined by such people as being a good leader. So in that sense, Stalin was a good leader because he had the strength, however you want to define that, to keep the country together, see the country through the Russian Civil War, see the country through its industrialization, basically the 5-year planning periods in the 1930s, see the country through World War II, and see the country through the early Cold War. And he did that through ruthlessness, through quotas, through brutality. Whatever he had to do, he did it. And some Russians see that as kind of being an evil characteristic that he did. Basically, he took an ends justify the means approach, that he was a bad leader that killed millions of Russians needlessly, and that he's kind of a stain on Russian history. But those people are kind of a minority. Generally, most Russians either support him or are kind of neutral. Kind of see him as a, in the context of his time, basically, that kind of thing. You know, sort of like some American historical figures are seen. You know, there's a number of historical figures in U.S. history who were owned slaves and, you know, did any number of things that would be morally repugnant today, but within the context of their time, not necessarily that bad, or at least normal. So kind of in a similar vein, some Russians look at Joseph Stalin and say, well, it was the mid-20th century, what do you want? Given the standard of the time, he did pretty well. If you're going to have a strongman, brutal, totalitarian leader in the mid-20th century, you might as well have Stalin, because at least he can get things done. That kind of logic, basically. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's kind of my understanding of the perspective in Russia. If you're Russian and I'm wrong, please point that out in chat. I would want to know. That's just my perspective. Please do correct me, if need be.
If you could kind of break it down by archetypes, it seems like people who are more kind of rallied by nationalism would think better of leaders that had more of that global presence than ones that had a smaller footprint. Mm-hmm. So kind of expanding it beyond just Russia and how Russians think of Stalin, how do countries think of the leaders who have done a lot of stuff that is both good and bad in different ways? Generally, nationalists would probably be more excited about those leaders than people who have more of a global perspective and don't want their country to be thought of as evil.
Yeah, that's very true. Nationalists generally have something of a bias when it comes to their national leaders and their respective nations' histories. So powerful leaders of any kind are generally venerated by the nationalist because they're seen as empowering the country, leading it into the future, overcoming challenges, etc. You know, if you're a nationalist, the niceties of politics are not as relevant as national power. And in that sense, the ends kind of justify the means, especially if you're a nation that has struggled with weakness frequently, as Russia has at several times in its history.
It also seems like propaganda plays a pretty key role as well. Like, propaganda is always present in every country, pretty much, to try and cast the leaders in a favorable light. But there are certain periods where it really comes in a big wave and the government is aggressively pushing a lot of propaganda, which I feel really shapes the perception, not just in that current time, but also in the way that it's remembered.
That's very true. You know, the context of your time, very much influences how it's remembered later on. You know, one of the difficult things that historians have to do is trying to kind of parse the difference between what was actually happening in a given time period and what resources from that time period portray events of the era as. And that's very difficult to do because it's very difficult to kind of parse subjective interpretation from reality. That's difficult to do now. You know, it's difficult to do in any time period, all the more difficult when you're dealing with time periods that can be decades, centuries, etc. in the past.
Stalin, you know, I just wanted to address something that kind of came up in the chat. So someone is saying Stalin is a monster this guy is a commie, referring to you. And I think they missed the initial premise, which was, how do Russians in general perceive Stalin? Like, how is he remembered overall? And one thing that we try to do is be neutral and even-handed with the types of discussions, and that's the type of discussion that actually isn't about our opinion at all, because neither of us are Russian, which we mentioned before. We're both American, born and raised. Have you been to Russia? I've not been to Russia.
No.
I know some Russians, and we've talked to some Russians, but talking to 5 Russians is not the same as knowing the perspective of all people in Russia or outside of Russia who are Russian. And yeah, you're not a communist. I know some people. They throw around words.
I hate to disappoint, but I'm afraid not.
Well, you could say not yet, right? Because maybe.
Yeah. I guess there's still time.
There's still time. There are books you could read that could change your perspective. Who knows?
Yeah, Russian politics is still kind of dealing with its Soviet past. There's kind of no real consensus there. A lot of the post-Soviet Russian governments, you know, principally the Putin government, have strived to try to put a positive spin on the Soviet period. And, you know, that's done partly for nationalist reasons, you know, just the sense that this is our country, we should be proud of our history. Yes, there have been problems, but there have also been a lot of successes. Let's focus on the successes, you know, that kind of attitude. But then there's also a lot of nationalists who just legitimately believe that, a lot of Russian nationalists who legitimately believe that the country can only really survive if it has a strong leader, kind of in the Stalinist vein. So there's a lot of that perspective. Now keep in mind, we're talking perspectives. The original question was he a good or bad leader? And my point was that's subjective. So the perspective in Russia is as described. Obviously in the West, he's generally perceived in a very negative way as being sort of a prototypical murderous mid-20th century despot of the totalitarian vein. You know, Hitler, Stalin, etc., killing millions of people, arbitrary reasons, etc., ideological reasons, etc. You know, whether or not he was an effective leader, that's kind of a different debate. Because the Soviet Union did industrialize significantly in the 1930s as a result of the 5-year plans. You know, it turns out threatening people with a lifetime in a death, you know, in a concentration camp, in a prison camp, if they don't meet quota, can be a pretty proficient way to get them to perform. It's not a particularly sustainable way, but in the least short to medium term, Stalin was able to kind of use that, along with a substantial amount of slave labor, in order to kind of modernize the country to some degree. Sufficiently so that by World War II, the Soviet Union was able to kind of hold its own industrially with Germany. Lend-Lease kind of helped with that, and that's kind of something I'm still researching. But Lend-Lease in World War II, the Soviet Union, is kind of a touchy subject for Russians, and it's kind of ambiguous the degree to which it really helped the Soviets. And it helped them at different points. It's getting off on a tangent. We can talk about that later if somebody wants. But basically, the Soviet Union did experience development under Stalin. And so you could make the case that if not for that development, the country would not have been ready, so to speak, for World War II. So however brutal Stalin may be, you could argue that he was effective in modernizing the country and preparing it for its inevitable endgame with Nazi Germany. Certainly that would be the argument by certain Russian nationalists who would support Stalin.
Well, there's also kind of the human question, which I think sometimes the viewers crave, and I think I'm a little bit more ready to say stuff like that than you are. I think you really like the neutrality, and that's fine. But for me, if you want that kind of personal answer, I would not want Stalin to be my president, and I would not let him watch my dog. just saying. I think in the moral capacity, he was a bad man. He was very insecure about his image and the way that he was perceived. He was probably not very good to his subordinates and whatnot. So on that front, I am definitely not pro-Stalin, and I doubt I ever will be. So if that's the answer that you're looking for, there you go. This is not a pro-Stalin stream.
Yeah, not quite. Not quite. There's still time,
yeah.
but not quite. Although to be fair, I don't think your dog would be a problem so long as he's not a running dog of the capitalist bosses.
No.
Just saying.
Yeah, well, would he take out Milo enough? Would he give him good kind of attention? I don't know. But yeah, I think that's kind of the opinion question. As Americans, we generally see Russia, especially in that era, as bad guys, just in general, and that's part of our bias, of our perspective. So kind of an awareness of that, of the historic enemies of your country, and how, I mean, maybe, yes, everything we heard about Stalin was true, and he was horrible, and just, we hope we never have another Stalin in the world. But maybe we've also had it drummed up a little bit. I would probably say that he's still a very bad man. But that's something to kind of be aware of, too, is who have you been taught is your enemy growing up, and does the evidence you've gathered on that support those claims? Because maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah. Certainly the American perspective is dead set against totalitarian. The political culture here is very, what you would call liberal in the classical sense, again, for the Americans listening. And in that sense, you know, authoritarianism and totalitarian ideologies are seen as just antithetical to the functioning of a modern civilization, or at least a modern society anyway. And so there's a great deal of deeply embedded skepticism of any kind of authoritarian political system. And it doesn't help that throughout American history, a lot of the people who have come to the United States have come from authoritarian political systems and that discriminated against them in some way. And that's happened, you know, all the way up until, you know, the modern era. You know, there's a substantive Vietnamese community in the United States, and a huge chunk of them are basically people who fled the communists during the Vietnam War. And so you can imagine how that paints the Vietnamese community's perspective of authoritarianism and communism in particular. So those kinds of perspectives have the most currency in American political culture, and in turn, there's an immense amount that in turn colors and informs the overarching American perspective of those kinds of political systems. To be fair, there was a lot of, I don't know if you can still say the word, but it used to be you would say pussyfooting. So there was a lot of pussyfooting around going on by American leftists in the mid-20th century with regard to Stalin, which led to which kind of exacerbated, you know, dislike for Stalinists and communists in general. This was more the 1930s when the purges were going on. There was an American reporter, and I don't remember his name, but he traveled to the Ukraine, and it happened during the big famine there, what the Ukrainians have come to call the Holodomor. And basically just millions of people were dying of starvation because the Soviet authorities were appropriating food from farmers and you know, distributing it in urban areas and basically other parts of the country. And they were in part doing it to punish farmers for not you know, towing the line on collectivization. There were a lot of farmers who were resisting collectivization because they didn't want to lose their farms, basically. And the Soviet government took a very hard line. It didn't help that there was just, I think, a drought that year as well, or something like that. So food production also took a hit. So the Soviets took the position that, all right, we'll just take all the food that you guys are making, we'll punish you by not letting you have any of it, and that'll help us alleviate the shortage in the other parts of the country that are more important anyway. That was sort of the Soviet perspective at the time anyway. So this journalist, an American journalist, went to the Ukraine and he saw all of this, but he kind of downplayed it because he was kind of sympathetic to the Soviet government. There were a lot of leftists and working, what would you call them, working class ideologues, working, you know, workers ideologues, workers activists who kind of sympathized to a degree with the Soviet Union as the working man's country. You know, communism was the working man's ideology, and the Soviets were the manifestation of that, standing up and fighting for workers' rights and against imperialism and all that, etc. And so this journalist was kind of among them, and he kind of downplayed what he saw, and as a result, there's been ever since people found out about that, when people found out that he had actually seen a great deal of people dying from famine and how bad things were, but hadn't reported it, that kind of produced an enduring suspicion. There was already an enduring suspicion, but that exacerbated an enduring suspicion of leftists in the United States generally, but also of totalitarian countries in general, because they were seen as having a lot of fellow travelers in different countries. You know, they had sympathizers in other countries who were were going out of their way to hide the warts, so to speak, of given countries, of those countries' systems. So again, whether Stalin was a good or bad leader, in summary, is just dependent on your perspective. If you don't like mass murder, if you don't like, if you don't like mass murder, and you don't like security quotas in which the police are required to round up political opponents, a certain number, and if they can't find any, they're just going to arbitrarily arrest people so they can meet quota. If you don't like those kinds of systems, or totalitarian systems in general, you're not going to like Stalin. Because he was very much a totalitarian bureaucrat. He's basically a supercharged bureaucrat in that sense. On the other hand, if you're a Russian nationalist, and you really like strong leaders who you think saved the country from foreign enemies, Stalin might be your guy. That might be sort of what you're looking for.
Well, the thing that you've said a couple times already is ends justify the means, and how by eliminating a lot of your opponents, which ethically and morally is a very evil thing to do, by doing that, you create more kind of unison in the command of your area, and you can oftentimes make more big moves that normally would have had some people who are grumpy about it and trying to work to oppose you. So, in that sense, he got a lot done. So if you're an ends that justifies the means kind of person, then that's your kind of stuff, like you're saying. But if you care about kind of a fair representation of the different voices in your municipality, and you don't really care for murdering people and trampling on your citizenry, then he's probably not top 5.
Yeah, it's not, his politics may not be your cup of tea, but his style may be your cup of tea, depending on the individual in question. Again, that's the ends justifies the means thing. That ends justifies the means is a style of politics that transcends ideology. Anybody of any ideology can approach politics in that manner. In general, liberal democratic societies eschew that. They see that as antithetical and unethical and all manner of goals. It's a no-no, basically. There's a norm against that, but not every political culture has that. And in those political cultures, those may be more desirable traits in a leader. So let's see. It depends on who you talk to. Short answer. Next question was, how powerful and wealthy do you think the British royal family is, and how much influence do you think they have in the world currently? I don't know how wealthy they are. I don't think they have any influence in the world currently, beyond the most superficial influence. I know if they pipe up and complain about something, more people pay attention than, say, if I would, or if somebody on the street did. But beyond that, I don't think the royal family has substantive political influence of almost any kind. There's a reason they call them figureheads. It's because they don't have any real power. I think technically they could refuse to accept a government to Parliament. But I think there is a mechanism in place now that would allow Parliament to basically override that. So even that is symbolic at this point. So within Britain, not a lot of power. Internationally, no real power. Basically they're just people. Basically the British royal family is a family that the British people pays to look nice and sound eloquent, and that's their whole job. Basically be a symbol of the country. It's
kind of a cultural relic too.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the countries that threw off their monarchies also threw off the heads of their monarchs, France. Yeah. And they really don't want to be reminded of that. They see that as something where they were actively oppressed. Whereas in England, it's kind of like, oh, isn't it? It's quaint. It's cool that we used to have leaders like this, and we still treat them well. Like, they get a castle, they get a big wedding, and they make the news every time they do anything. They're kind of like movie stars at this point, is kind of how I perceive the news about them. More so than any sort of political capital. Like, I have no idea what the political orientation of the Queen is, really. Everything I hear about her is how long her reign has been, and I'm focused on what kind of hat she's wearing.
Yeah.
They're very fashionable, to be fair.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, again, you want your national symbols to be pretty. Like a nice painting.
Yeah.
Or a nice flag. Yeah. That's kind of what the royal family is. They're sort of just dolls you dress up now and again.
Yeah, they're people, too. And I wonder sometimes if you could kind of get into their perspective of if that bothers them in some way. That it used to be kind of the complete seat of power and military control, and now they look nice, but they don't actually do too much. If that's like an existential thing you have to grapple with as a member of the British royal family.
I don't know that it is, because I think it's kind of reflects the similar perspective amongst idle rich, basically. Mm-hmm. People who are super wealthy and can kind of afford to do their own pursuits as they like. I think it's more that mentality. Mm-hmm. Sort of an old Tory mentality. You know, the sense that you can kind of live in your big estate in the countryside and be wealthy and just pursue your personal interests, maybe be, you know, get into the House of Lords and be irrelevant there, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You know, just sort of be generically rich and cultured. Mm-hmm. And try to support the arts and other things that you think are refined that old money type people would do. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a sense that you're preserving tradition, supporting the arts, supporting, you know, basically patronizing things that are worthy of patronage. Mm-hmm. Sort of the old rich mentality. I think that's more their mental space. A little bit different in the case of the royal family, because they didn't necessarily make their own fortune. They kind of get paid, so to speak, by the government, but you know, that's still how they behave. They have a whole slew of traditions and old family ceremonies and honors and etc. that they all kind of hold up as being worthy of preservation. Mm-hmm. They seek to kind of adhere to that, but they seek to honor that by continuing those traditions and by maintaining them through their own behavior and class and behavior, etc. Running out of adjectives, but you get the idea.
Yeah. I think it was Prince Harry. There's a GIF of him that gets posted sometimes where he served in Afghanistan, I believe, as a Black Hawk helicopter pilot or something.
Yeah, Apache.
Yeah, Apache, yeah. So, I mean, he's done some shit, so it seems like they're not, like, totally idle. They try to also kind of represent their people and be British, and also not in a way that is totally removed from society. So they're still kind of integrated. They want to take their own risks and that kind of thing, which is pretty cool.
Well, that in itself is actually a tradition. You know, that's encouraged amongst, I think, more the family's sons. I don't know if the daughters do as have they even really had any daughters? Not recently. I guess they're all sons. Queen Elizabeth was probably the last one. I don't think she's had any daughters.
Diana? Is Diana?
Well, no, that was a daughter-in-law.
Oh.
That was brought into the family.
Oh.
People who were, I mean, a daughter born into the royal family and raised in the family.
Right.
I don't think there's actually been one for a while.
Mm.
But at least for the sons, they're kind of encouraged to engage with the public in some way. Military service has been one that they've done before. Who's the son of Queen Elizabeth?
Charles?
The father. Charles. I think that's it. He did something similar during the Falklands War. He was actually serving in the British military when the Falklands War happened, and I think he actually did serve in the conflict. Mm-hmm. So there is kind of this history of the sons of the royal family, at least, being involved in the nation's military. And, you know, it's not necessarily always the military. They might do other things, too. I know one of the current princes was not in the military, I think. He did something else. But in general, there's a sense that the royal family, and this is also something that idle rich in general kind of perceive, this is kind of a cultural norm for their community. There's a sense that if you're wealthy and powerful, you have some obligation to maintain a connection with the public. You have an obligation to society to help it in some fashion. Mm-hmm. So patronizing the arts, but also engaging in philanthropy. Those are all seen as not necessarily requirements. They're not like legal obligations, but they are norms that you are encouraged to observe. It's kind of considered part of your role in society as a wealthy elite to kind of observe those norms and engage with them.
You don't have to join the military, but you do will be very proud.
Yeah. Yeah, you can kind of see something similar in Texas. Like in Houston, there's a lot of wealthy oil families with oil money. And they all have regular, you know, fundraisers for this, that, or the other charity. And I think there was a documentary I was watching a while back, and they were talking to one of the women there, and she basically said that, you know, you can be in our community, but if you want to be in our community, you have to kind of engage in these kinds of things. Otherwise, you can't really be a part of the club, right? So all of the networking, all of the connections, all of the social functions that you would want to engage in as a wealthy elite, because part of being a wealthy elite is engaging in networking that helps your business amongst other wealthy elites. You get locked out of that, basically, if you don't engage, if you're not seen as participating enough in the activities that are seen as correspondent with the norms of behavior for somebody in your position in society. So there is a kind of social mechanism to enforce those norms in place in sort of those Houston circles. Excuse me. Let's see. So yeah, they're not that powerful, really. I don't know how wealthy they are in Britain per se. I don't have a dollar amount for that. Probably Google it easily enough, but actually I could just do that now. Couldn't I? Royal family, total wealth. How much money? Let's see, 383 million pounds, which is about $500 million. That's what Google says anyway. Make of that what you will.
Half a billionaire.
Hardly a billionaire at all then, are you? Let's see, so that's how much they're worth, but they don't have a lot of political power either inside Britain or outside Britain.
Call them temporarily embarrassed billionaires.
They're getting there. They're getting there. They just got to work their way back up. Let's see. What were the initial motives of why England and France became hostile toward each other? How did the conflict continue? And why did it stop? Okay. Let me see if I can remember. Because the Franco-English, basically, rivalry have roots in different disagreements. So you could go all the way back to the 100 Years' War. And back then, that was when, I don't remember what the dynasty was, basically, but the family line that ruled Britain before the 100 Years' War started technically had links to the family that was ruling France at the time. And this would have been about, 1300s? You know, 100 years started in about 1350 or so kind of somewhere in there. And so basically the King of France, and if I'm getting this wrong, please correct me in chat, but from what I remember, the King of France died and there was a succession crisis, and the English king used his family linkage to the French royal family to claim the French throne. And that's what sparked the series of conflicts called the 100 Years' War. It was not actually one war that lasted 100 years. It was actually a series of interrelated conflicts, basically over this issue, that broke out over the course of 100 years. All of them involving some iteration of England trying to invade France. And that kind of created, well, that was the progenitor of a great deal of conflict around the 1300s and 1400s. Eventually that was settled, and a new dynasty took power in France that kind of ejected the English, partly with the help of, what's her name? Joan of Arc. That was sort of part of what her story was, helping that family line retake the throne and push the English out. And after that, there was more stable relations between them. And then that lasted probably until, what? More or less the colonial period, I think. Because France was a lot more concerned about the Holy Roman Empire, and then later on with Austria. And, well, the Holy Roman Empire, and then with the Habsburg Empire, centered on Spain, and then Austria, and the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family. Those were the principal rivals of France sort of in that period, the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. And so the rivalry with England kind of died down at that point. And then it kind of came back in the colonial period when they were competing over territories in the New World, in the Americas, and in East Asia, and, well, East Asia and South Asia in particular. So there was a lot of colonial competition that sort of rebirthed, re-energized the rivalry between them. And that, of course, led to the colonial wars in the 16 and 1700s. And then later manifested as the Napoleonic War, which was kind of a pseudo-colonial war, in a sense. A good chunk of it was fought in colonies, hence the colonial side of it. Of course, it was principally ideological and continental in nature, but the British wanted to try to make sure nobody ever took control of the entirety of continental Europe. So in that sense, they got involved for that reason. So that also served to exacerbate the rivalry. After that, the rivalry kind of died down because France's population started to stagnate in the early 19th century. And there was also a kind of concordant after the Napoleonic Wars in which all of the European powers agreed basically not to go to war with each other and try to kind of maintain stability on the continent, as well as a common line on liberalism and nationalism. There was a common agreement that they should all try to suppress liberalism as much as possible to maintain the status quo and the conservative monarchies that are already in power. So that reduced conflict in Europe to pretty much nothing until the Crimean War in 1850, 53, whenever it was. And at that point, France and Britain started to see common cause in certain areas, in particular with regard to the Ottoman Empire. So when the Ottoman Empire was declining, they saw a common cause in making sure that the Russian Empire did not benefit by the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And so when the Russians went to war with the Ottoman Empire, or just before the Crimean War, there was a sense that the Russians were making their move and that they might seize a substantial amount of Ottoman territory, maybe even Constantinople, and that if that happened, Russia would have a significantly improved position strategically in Europe. And they didn't want that, so they intervened. That's what the Crimean War was basically about. And because they both had a common interest in that, they fought together. And so that kind of started an unofficial alliance between France and Britain that was sort of on again, off again for the next half century, because they still had imperial rivalry. You know, there was the big imperial rush into Africa, so that generated tension. But a lot of the tensions in the colonial territories after that, you know, in the late 19th century were generally smoothed over. They were pretty minor. Generally, they were not a big issue. You know, there were some points of particular tension, you know, the Moroccan crisis and the early 1900s being a case in point. But beyond that, they were more or less on the same page. Less so in the late 19th century, but more so in the lead up to World War I. Because in the lead up to World War I, it became apparent that Germany was very powerful, was basically the preeminent power in Central Europe, and France would not be able to handle them by themselves. So France went out of their way to ally with Russia, and that created sort of the cornerstone of the Entente Cordiale that formed the basis of the Allied alliance and the Western Alliance anyway in World War I. Britain was a little cagey, but nominally they preferred France because they saw Germany as the greater threat. Again, Britain doesn't want any one power to be the most, you know, to take over Europe. So containing the most powerful country is generally the crux of British foreign policy in Europe, or at least has been historically. So the rivalry kind of stems from different factors and different time periods. You could go all the way back to the 100 Years' War and look at the succession crisis. And then there was kind of a pause, and then the colonial competition. And then there was another pause, and then they basically became allies because they had common interests. So that's a rough summary from someone who may or may not be remembering that correctly. You know, again, I really encourage people who have a stronger background and more recent reading on this to help me out in chat if they can, if so inclined. Let's see. So the next question was, new technology has a way of temporarily upsetting the balance of society. Due to the exponential growth of technology, we seem to experience these upsets with increasing frequency. Could the social order industrialized nations, i.e. liberal democracies, break down entirely under the onslaught? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You know, how can or how will societies handle the stresses caused by structural economic change wrought by technological innovation? Nobody knows, because this is unprecedented territory. This is not something anybody's ever done before. There's no real precedent you can point to in history. There have been other times of technological innovation, but never anything to this scale. So this is an entirely new social experiment, what you would call a natural experiment. We're going to test to see whether or not we collapse our own civilization with our innovation. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. It'll be certainly fun to try. We'll just have to wait and see. I really have no idea, though, because it's very difficult to make long-term predictions. I think we talked in a previous episode about how difficult it is to make how impossible it is to make predictions across a long period of time. You know, in the long term. Short to medium term, you can kind of do, because generally factors in the present don't change all that much in the short to medium term. They can change dramatically, but generally they don't. But in the long term, even the most seemingly fixed, unchangeable of variables can change dramatically. And that being the case, it's just impossible to do long-term projections like that. So maybe over the long term, there's an accumulation, a critical mass of innovations and changes happening within a short enough compressed time period that society just can't handle it, and fractures in some fashion in a way that inhibits the innovation down to a more manageable level. That's possible. On the other hand, it could be that society adapts around the constant innovation and constant rate of change and generates new norms of behavior, new institutions, new expectations that allow society to cope with this constant level of change and to thrive under it. That's also possible. But again, because this has never been done before, we don't really know what that would look like either way. You know, we don't know what kind of changes would be necessary to really cope with this degree of change. We don't even know if this degree of change is sustainable over the long run, you know, whether or not at some point it'll kind of reach a tipping point where it starts to kind of tail off. But if it does continue uninhibited, we don't know what kind of changes we really need to kind of adapt to it. And we don't really know what kind of signs would harbinge. What's the word I want? No, it slips my mind. Basically, we don't know what signs would indicate the collapse of society because of the constant rate of change. We don't really know how to interpret that. Maybe they're already happening and we don't recognize them. Or maybe they haven't happened yet. Or maybe we need an even greater amount of innovation and change in order to really stress society. Maybe we're still within manageable levels right now.
Well, one thing that's also kind of up in the air is how we're defining society and what we're expecting for ourselves to be living good lives as citizens in the world. Like, that definition is changing as the kind of foundations of the way we experience life are changing. So it's a very loaded kind of long-term projecting the future kind of question. And the fun thing is there are lots of people in the world whose job it is to tell you how that's going to pan out.
Yeah.
With a lot of futurists, not all of them, but there are some futurists who have very clear benchmarks of, in 2030, this is going to happen. And in 2035, this and this are going to happen. And then, 5 years from then, this is going to happen. It's like, ooh. That's a fun mental exercise, but there are a lot of unexpected things that tend to happen that really change the state of the game that you can't really predict. That principle scales down to smaller systems, too. For someone like me who's a streamer, I have my normal revenue, my normal growth of stream, but it's kind of like 1 or 2 times per year. Something unexpected that wasn't planned for happens that really boosts the growth. And I have no idea when that's going to happen, but it usually happens. But I can't really predict how big of an impact that's going to be, which is kind of like a smaller instance of the bigger picture of progress, which is not just the same rate all the time.
You would call that in economics positive externalities.
Ooh.
Yeah, let's put that into your next dinner conversation.
And then everyone will be confused and amazed.
There you go, that's the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like Neuro says, it's just very difficult to predict in the long term. And we don't know enough about how society, again, however you want to define that, you don't really know how society responds to these kinds of stresses, having not really seen these kinds of stresses before. And so it's difficult to interpret responses. You just need more data. And unfortunately, the problem with social science in general, not just with this issue, is that by the time you have enough data to really understand the phenomena, generally it's played out and has started to be replaced by something else. So it may be that the pace of change is so great now that we just never really have the time or comprehension to really understand what's happening, what kind of changes are happening, fast enough to really respond to them and handle their fallout. So it could be that we really are just in a period of constant change, chaos, and just constantly reacting to things too slowly to really have a substantive impact. Basically, short answer, your guess is as good as mine. Let's see. So, next question. We had a lot of questions today. Let's see. Next question was, how did the Mongols manage to conquer China circa 1205? To my knowledge, China was something of an economic and military superpower in the known world, so how did the Mongols conspire to defeat a unified and powerful foe? We talked a little bit about this last week, actually, I think, or well, the previous session, quote unquote. Basically, settled civilizations, urban civilizations, in the ancient period, on up until the medieval period, were at a distinct disadvantage relative to large roving bands of nomads. Because if you're, especially if you're talking like Central Asian steppe nomads, who were very proficient, were very proficient at riding horses. They were very good horsemen, and and occasionally, all the different tribes of these steppe people would gather together and form large coalitions. And the result is that they were able to form very large, fast armies very quickly. And generally, these light, fast cavalry armies, which did not require a lot of logistics. They knew how to live off the land. They didn't require like somebody to pay them. Like if you're a city-state or a large civilization like China at the time, if you want to raise an army, you got to pay for it. So that means you got to go to the trouble of organizing it. You got to find people who are politically reliable to lead them, because you don't want somebody to use the army to kick you out of power and take over. You got to find people to recruit. You got to train them. You got to provide for them. There's a lot of hassle involved. None of that is required for a steppe nomad. All he has to do is say, hey, let's go and kill people and steal shit. And if you can get enough people, then you can raise a huge army by classical standards in a very short amount of time. And you can do it a lot faster than anybody can respond to it. And that's the thing. By the time Beijing realizes that there's a giant army of nomads racing down on them on their horses, they really don't have enough time to really respond. They can mobilize an army maybe after the fact, but generally by then it's too late. And generally their armies are a lot slower too. That's one of the reasons why the Chinese military, by the mid 1500s, 1600s, was actually a lighter and more cavalry-centric army than their equivalents in India or Europe, because their principal threat up to that point had been basically nomadic raiders from the central steppe. And in order to kind of keep pace with them, in order to have the speed necessary to respond to them, they had to have a very large army of cavalry at the ready that was able to kind of go toe-to-toe with them and match their mobility. Mobility is very important in warfare. In military science, mobility is one of the principal advantages you can have over an opponent, because you can just appear magically in the most inconvenient spot for your opponent if you have more mobility. You're just sort of there, and then they're screwed. That's the advantage of mobility.
Just to interject, the game that I'm in right now, I'm specifically abusing my mobility against my opponent. So it's very appropriate that this topic will come up right now, of all times. But the other thing that I wanted to kind of add into this is the meta of how conventions of war develop, and how in certain eras it's kind of like, this is how we do war with each other. I get my army over here, you get your army over there, and then we're going to meet here in the field and we're going to fight each other. And with the Mongols, it was like they're using an entirely different toolkit, and they're not respecting the meta of conventional war at all. They're just like, nope, every one of our people are on horses. We are entirely cavalry, and we're archers on horseback. Good luck. It's like a totally different game. So a lot of the tools that were used for conventional warfare at the time just aren't even useful in that situation. And it's not so much that, oh yeah, China and them, they're bad. It's like they're not prepared for that type of threat. And it took a while for the world to kind of catch up and be able to stop them from just ransacking everything.
Yeah, this is not a Chinese-specific problem either. The Mongols also did the same thing to Central Asian city-states, to the Middle East. They famously burned Baghdad and, wrecked its library, through a huge amount. I think there was a scholar at the time who wrote that the Euphrates ran black with the ink of the books that they were destroying, that they were throwing into the river. Apparently Genghis Khan had a prejudice against books that he had achieved in China. I don't know where that came from, but that's what I read anyway.
Well, from what I heard, he got rid of basically everything that he found after he got some value from it. So if there was a text that had some military intel, he would figure that out, like what was in that, and then he would dispose of it so no one else got that advantage. So it wasn't so much that he was a hater of books so much as he was not willing to give anyone a fraction of an edge if he could keep it for himself.
Gotcha. Well, the mobility is the key thing. The mobility of the Mongol armies, their ability to just kind of pop out of nowhere and to run around, basically run circles around enemy armies, more conventional infantry armies from these more established civilizations. That's really what gave them a big edge. I might add that it was not easy for settled civilizations to raise cavalry armies, to generate cavalry, because it was kind of expensive to teach people how to ride cavalry. You know, because if you're a farmer, you spend all your time farming. Generally, it's only your wealthier noblemen who can have the kind of time necessary to really practice horse riding skills, equestrian skills, if you like. I think that's the correct technical term, anyway. So generally, there were not as many people with that skill set available for service, and generally they wanted a relatively high price. Whereas, again, with the Mongol army, everybody already knows that. They spent their whole life doing it. They're just basically born masters of the horse. Mm-hmm. So they can just run circles around your guys. They just outnumber your cavalry, and they're better and more skilled. It wasn't really until, I think, the 1500s or 1600s that civilizations like China, Europe, India, etc. were able to build large enough armies and had large enough contingents of cavalry to really put a dent, basically stop categorically all of these Central Asian nomads. You know, there was no more real threat posed by Central Asian nomads after the 1500s. And I think China even basically killed most of theirs. There was a period in the 1600s, 1700s where there was a series of campaigns launched into central nomadic territory, you know, kind of Mongolia, that area. And there was one, they basically either subdued the tribes or they wiped them out. There was one tribe in particular, I think, that was resisting, and they just basically committed one of the big acts of genocide in history against them. They systematically wiped them out. And so that eliminated the threat basically once and for all. And part of the reason that they were able to do that at that point is because civilization had kind of reached a critical mass of size, population, economic heft, economic development, technological development, that they were able to kind of field the armies with the necessary logistics to support a prolonged deployment far away from bases into nomadic territory. So roughly, that's my understanding of how the Mongols did this. Somebody who studied the Mongols more might have some more detail for you, but that's the most I can conjure off the top of my head. Let's see. So the next question was, do you see the poor economic situation and massive civil dissatisfaction? Wait, do you see the poor economic situation and massive civil dissatisfaction bring about the demise of Venezuela Maduro regime anytime soon? Okay, do I think that these factors, the economic situation and civil dissatisfaction, will bring about the demise of Venezuela's Maduro regime anytime soon? No, I don't. And the reason I don't is because the Maduro regime has enough political support from enough of the population to stay in power. And this is one of the reasons I've been really critical of the opposition's boycotting of the vote. You know, boycotts are only really a good way to go if you have a substantial critical mass of the population on your side. But when it's more half and half or 60-40, that's a bad idea, because then you're basically just giving your opponents, who are either equally as powerful politically as you or almost as powerful, you're just giving them power. You're just giving them the government. And that's a bad idea at this stage. It would have been better to try to compete harder and to try to erode the government support and then make a big push later if necessary. That's my perspective. Of course, I'm not like an expert on that, but that's just my 2 cents. I guess I'm editorializing in a sense. But basically, no, I don't think the opposition has enough support to really pose a threat to the Maduro government. You know, one of the consistent things I've read about opposition, people who are against the Maduro government anyway, is that they're also very critical of the opposition political parties and opposition figures. And that bodes ill well, basically, for the future of the opposition. It suggests that they're going to continue to be fractured, segregated, and ineffective, you know, unable to kind of unite under a common purpose and flag and leadership in a way that would give them the political power they need in order to really compete with the Chavistas. So most likely the Maduro regime will continue to be relatively unpopular, but they'll stay in power. You know, they've kind of become ensconced in government. They have a broad constituency in the country that is either dependent on their handouts or wants their handouts or believes in their ideological message religiously. And they also have institutional support from certain institutions like the military, welfare agencies, agencies that are tied to Chavista party organs, etc. You know, all of that is kind of tied into a common party state system. And that gives them also a lot of defense and a lot of staying power. So I don't think things are bad enough in Venezuela to kind of change the minds of a lot of the core base of the Chavistas. And until that happens, I don't think anything will really change. So that's not great news, but that's just my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. But, you know, that is my perspective. I don't see things improving in the short to medium term. Oh, hey, it's Jordan Peterson again.
Yay!
Do you think Jordan Peterson's claim that, quote-unquote, Marxism is a murderous doctrine holds water? I don't pretend to be knowledgeable enough about those things to have an opinion either way, end quote. Yeah, Jordan Peterson comes up from time to time. And I still haven't read enough of his stuff to have like a fully formed opinion,
Dude,
background knowledge.
you don't even know the half of it. I wish you knew how many times I get asked about that man. I'm to the point where I've been asked so many times that I almost don't even want to know. I haven't really done like a Jordan Peterson investigation time. But it's a question that comes up a lot, I think, because he's one of the new talking heads. He's like a person who is involved in academia and sciences and stuff, so he has credentials, and then now he's talking about society and giving a lot of that cultural commentary and stuff, which I think a lot of people want that cultural commentary from people who do have some expertise.
Yeah.
And he is that new guy. And one of the things that kind of distinguishes him from the pack is he has a lot of stuff to say kind of critical of feminism, especially the current wave of feminism and stuff. So someone in the chat was actually joking about it, where if you search for Jordan Peterson videos, YouTube is going to suggest a lot of feminism bashing videos along with that. So that's kind of I guess, the alignment of some of his content. I mean, I don't know enough about him to say that he is universally against that, but it is related material online.
Yeah, my understanding of him is that the core of his message is based on self-improvement and self-sufficiency. And, you know, from what I've seen of him in that vein, you know, I pretty much agree with all of it. I don't have a problem with any of that. But sometimes he'll kind of transition from that into feminism is Nazism, and it's a little jarring. I'm not really quite sure what the logic is there. I would have to read more what his perspective is to kind of get into that. The Marxism is a murderous doctrine idea is not something unique to Jordan Peterson. That's been around for a long time, basically for as long as there's been anti-communism. So, does it hold water? I mean, it depends on how you want to judge Marxism. If you just want to look at Marxism, the idea, that's one thing. If you want to look at how Marxism is practiced, that's another thing. Marxism, the idea, is just all about political economy. It's basically Karl Marx's critique, political economy analysis of late 19th century European political economy. And he was first and foremost a political economist in that sense, not necessarily an ideologue. Although he did support a lot of the workers' rights, socialist type movements that kind of popped up at the time. Not particularly effectively, as I recall, but nominally that sort of was his politics. But Marxism itself, the idea, the theory, etc., is more of a theoretical work than it is, you know, an ideological drive to empower workers and disempower the capitalist classes. Marx himself was trying to describe how he thought the political systems of his day would evolve in response to the pressures being put on them by economic changes that were occurring in that period at the same time. And so in that sense, it's more of an academic perspective. And a lot of the political side of that, you know, a lot of the politicized ideological type tinge to Marxism was kind of added later by subsequent ideologues, subsequent philosophers, subsequent thinkers. You know, there's a reason the ideology of the Soviet Union was called Marxism-Leninism and not Marxism. Lenin actually took Marxism and said, okay, we think that this is the basis for predicting what's going to happen. We think that workers will be empowered in future. How do we actually operationalize that into tangible action? So a lot of the actual revolutionary organization, a lot of the bureaucracy, a lot of the actual practical side of organizing workers, forming organizations, that's what Leninism is about. So Marxism is just the overarching theory, sort of the overarching faith, so to speak. Whereas Leninism is the actual how-to guide. How do you have a revolution? How do you run a government, etc.?
Can I interject with a point?
Sure.
So the fact that the word used in the question was murderous I think says a lot about what he's trying to do with his claims about Marxism. Because murderous is not a very academic word to use when you're describing, like, economies, politics, and stuff like that. That's one that I think tends to resonate with people's emotions more, because people are like, murder? Oh my goodness, murder is... That's ridiculous, that's intense, like, that's pure evil. Okay, well, he used murderous as an anchor for how people are going to talk about the question, as opposed to, is Marxism just an inferior ideology to maybe some other ones? That one is putting it more kind of in an ordinal capacity of, if we're ordering up all the different ideologies you can have, is it not the best? Whereas this one is like, it really sets the tone for the question, I think. And when you're phrasing a question or when you're looking at someone making a claim, the word choice is pretty important for where they're coming from and how they're trying to tackle it.
Yeah, there is kind of a values judgment implicit in the statement, certainly. But to kind of flesh it out, you know, Marxism, Leninism, that's kind of separate than Marxism. So Marxism is just sort of a broad, general attempt, academic attempt to analyze political economy in the late 19th century. That's more what Marxism is specifically. Later on, in practice, Marxism in practice, so to speak, you know, the attempt to operationalize it into an ideology, into a governing system, resulted in the Soviet Union, Stalinism, Pol Pot, the Vietnam, what would you call them? I guess boat people is what generally they're referred to. The people who fled Vietnam after the Vietnam War. North Korea, Communist Party of China, and all of the corresponding atrocities, mass murders, etc. So in the practice, there's a problem. So we could then ask, is there something inherent to Marxist ideology or Marxist thinking that lends itself to these kinds of governments? Does Marxism inevitably lead to mass political violence of one sort or another? Well, that's a tricky debate because in part it's subjective, you know. Obviously, there have been a lot of examples, but there's also a lot of Marxists in the West that have not become particularly violent. And Marxism in Western Europe and in the United States kind of morphed, was influenced, or perhaps itself influenced democracy, basically evolved in a way that reflected liberal democratic institutions to be softer and less inclined to basically try to blow up the status quo on principle. Generally, communism was at its most virulent in the societies that were the least politically flexible. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with regard to Russian liberal reformers. Liberal reformers in Russia under the Tsar became more and more radicalized the less and less success they had. The longer they went without any ability or any indication from the Tsar that he was willing to give any kind of concession, the more people came to think that violence was the only way to exact change. And in those societies, generally you saw communists come to power. China, Russia, and then in sundry totalitarian states in other parts of the world. So I think part of Jordan Peterson, his specific logic here with regard to the Marxism is murder idea, or is a murderous doctrine, I think kind of stems more from his background as a, what's the word I want? Not a psychologist, but a clinical psychologist, something to that effect. That's kind of more his perspective. And so I think his thinking is that Marxist thinking is a kind of victim thinking. It sort of emphasizes people as inherently victims of overarching systems. There's a system in place in which the wealthy preserve their power and suppress the less wealthy. And so the less wealthy are then victims. And that's extrapolated into gender relations and into international relations. There are powerful, wealthy countries that use their power to suppress weaker, poorer countries. So they're victims. So basically, I think Jordan Peterson's perspective is that Marxist thinking lends itself to getting people to think as victims, and as such, they become de facto revolutionaries, thinking that they are victims and that they need justice and that they can't get it, and that the only way to get it is to lash out, whether it's actually legitimate grievances or not. So basically he's saying that it creates illegitimate grievances where there need not be any, where previous people would just kind of tough it out and try to make their own way and fit into society. Instead, Marxism teaches people to think as victims and act out.
There's a concept that's present when you're kind of in psychology or cognitive science that's called an operational definition, which means that you have a way to specifically measure the type of thing you're trying to talk about. Because, like, murderous ideology, my question would be, how do you operationally define how murderous an ideology is? Is it by the number of people who die per society that holds that ideology? It seems like a very nebulous concept to me. So for him to claim that seems like, all right, well, what does that mean for you to say that? As opposed to some people will kind of fall into the argument from authority thing, which is, oh, a credentialed person said something, therefore it is true. Which I think makes it really hard to be a public intellectual who is productive, because a lot of people are going to trust you just from the outset that what you're saying is true, without you having to kind of back it up with some form of argumentation. It's like, oh, yeah, he said this, it's a fact.
Well, that's a legitimate point. And I think to kind of cover the definition side of that, I think he's thinking not of Marxism as like a present force in Western civilization, but rather as kind of the progenitor of what he calls cultural Marxism, which he refers to in some of his interviews, at least the ones I've seen. And I think his idea there, his definition, is that cultural Marxism is sort of takes the DNA, so to speak, takes the core logic of Marxism, which is that there are systems in which powerful people influence society, use their influence on society to suppress others in order to preserve their power, and extrapolates that to everything, basically. You know, not just socioeconomic circumstances, but also gender, international relations, etc. Just any kind of relation between people has this logic applied to it. So that for him is what cultural Marxism is, and he sees that in a lot of the politics and a lot of modern politics. His criticism of leftist politics in general, certainly far left politics. You know, to be fair to him, maybe he's focusing more on far left politics specifically, but he sees in that style of politics the kind of victim-centric thinking that he attributes to cultural Marxism, which he in turn attributes to the influence of Marxism in the late 19th century, early 20th century. If somebody's more familiar with his logic on this, please do correct me in chat. This is just what I remember from what little I've read of him and his thinking on it. But I'm trying to give him a fair representation of his logic and reasoning here. So in that sense, you could argue that Marxism is a murderous doctrine in so much as it's lent itself to instability today. Because part of what he attributes part of the malign influence of cultural Marxism, according to Jordan Peterson's definition, is, for example, school shootings. You know, he says he's struggled as a clinical psychologist. Again, I may not be remembering that correctly, so maybe I should. Whatever his background, academic background is, he's kind of from that perspective tried to approach the question of why do people engage in school shootings? And one of the answers he's come up with is that it's partly the influence of cultural Marxism making people think like victims. So these kids get bullied, and then because they're bullied, they feel like victims, and cultural Marxism, according to Jordan Peterson's definition, compels them to act as a victim and lash out against their perpetrators in an act of revenge. Again, trying to give him a fair representation of his logic as I'm remembering it from what I've seen of him. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But if that's the case, that raises the question of whether or not there is a real linkage there. And that's kind of the weakness in the argumentation, which is that it's not entirely clear just what kind of influence cultural Marxism, as he defines it, actually has on society, how wide-ranging it is. You can see colloquial, anecdotal examples of things that seem like they're influenced by his definition of cultural Marxism, but the substantive linkages are unclear. It's hard to analyze something that's that amorphous. And certainly when it comes to something like school shootings, which are inherently difficult to analyze. You know, the FBI tried to create a profile of school shooters and was actually unable to, because there are so many different variables and there are so many differences between all of the school shooters that there is no real one common theme. So I don't think it's entirely really possible at this point, given current amounts of information, to just peg school shootings and other, you know, social ills on one particular cultural influence. And, you know, that's ignoring the ambiguity of the definition of cultural Marxism, which itself as a force is debatable. You know, the degree to which that's really a thing, so to speak. Certainly there are people who kind of represent the caricature of somebody who follows that. But the extent to which those people are influential or as powerful or in any great number, that's debatable.
Steven Pinker has some input on that type of action. So he talks about the person, usually it's a man in society, who goes on a killing spree and then kills himself, and how that situation has existed before guns, and how a lot of times it's linked to usually some last-ditch effort to change the way that your social group perceives you in a way that you are remembered. And we have a saying in English, which is, if you can't be famous, be infamous. It's kind of like the last-ditch effort on that front, where at the base level, you have an agent in the world, a human being, who wants some kind of recognition and validation for their personhood. They want the community to think of them well, in a very basic capacity. And how we've talked about this in a few previous sessions, in the digital era, we have more of a global perspective of that range of success. And then I think it was the previous session we talked about, we have the hyper successful who filter to the top. So when you go on Facebook and Instagram and Twitch, you see the people who are ridiculously successful. And a lot of these people see that range and they see their distance from the top, and they feel like they're kind of in the zone where I can't be famous, I need to be infamous now, kind of thing, which presents its own kind of problem. And on top of that, you have the awareness of your malcontent with not fitting in, not having a group of friends who appreciate you. And we're social animals. We really care about having at least a few quality friends where we feel fulfilled talking to them. We feel like our friends respect us. We feel like we bring value to our friends' lives. A lot of these things people take for granted once they have them. But if you look at a person who doesn't have those things, they tend to be very much on edge. Because it's kind of a survival need, in a way. The same way you can look at a great ape or a monkey. If you pull them out of their group of apes or monkeys and you hold them captive, they'll never really feel fulfilled because they're not part of their team. They're not part of their group. They feel like they're not connected, and you can feed them, you can keep them safe, you can give them water, but they're never going to have that kind of satisfactory life. So you have that sense of how fulfilled is this organism, and to what lengths are they willing to go to be recognized in some capacity. So that's the one side. And then the flip side is the ease of access to violent means, which is its own discussion. We talk about guns too much already. But there's that.
We melted down chat a couple times doing that.
Yeah, there's that. And then there's also the, what was I going to say? The basic notion of trends. So suicide is one of them, where we have people like Chester Bennington and who's the vocalist? His name's escaping me. But if you have a few suicides in mass media, then you have a whole bunch more of them because people see that as an option. So school shooting is kind of in a similar category, where if people see a whole bunch of them in the media, they think of that as an option that they can take. So it's more available in their memory, in their decision making, than it would be if people hadn't done this in a long time, and it's kind of on the back burner. Chris Cornell, thank you. He's very good vocalist. Very sad to lose him.
Yeah, that's a good review. I like that.
Yeah.
But the overarching point is that there's a lot of potential explanations, but not really enough that is known for certain to really pin any one explanation. You know, to really explain it with any one as being the result of any one factor. So I'm a little wary when anybody, not just Jordan Peterson, says that, oh, this one thing is what's responsible for school shootings. Or even this one thing is the principal factor, not the only factor, but the principal factor. You know, that automatically sets off alarm bells for me. So to get back to the original question, is the argument that Marxism is a murderous doctrine, does that hold water? I think Jordan Peterson's argumentation on this count is a little weak. I think a lot of his evidence is anecdotal. There's not a lot of quantitative analysis, and He doesn't really engage in some of the deeper analytical type reflection that I think would be necessary, that would be necessary to really flesh out this idea that he has on this count. So I think that aspect is weak. Now, if we extrapolate, if we extract away, abstract, that's the word I want. If we abstract away from Jordan Peterson specifically, and just ask generically, is Marxism a murderous doctrine? You could find a better argument there, in the sense that there has been a long track record of ideologies inspired by Marxism becoming totalitarian and very violent. So in that sense, you could say that it is a murderous doctrine. Explaining exactly how you go from being influenced by Marxism to becoming a totalitarian government is a little more unclear. That's a bit ambiguous. Again, Jordan Peterson kind of tries to approach that indirectly with some of his criticisms, but again, I'm not entirely convinced by his argumentation. I think the logic needs more thought and more research to really kind of be fleshed out on that count. So, maybe. Maybe it's a murderous doctrine. In part, it's a judgment call, because certainly the degree to which you judge whether an ideology is healthy or dangerous or what have you kind of comes down to your personal perspective. It depends on how much risk you're kind of willing to take. Communists have done some good things, so it's not as though all communists are inherently evil. But given how much bad things they have done, it would be understandable if somebody said, let's kind of play it safe and just not allow these people here. Again, it's a judgment call, and everybody has to make that call with any given ideology in any given society. So I think I've tried anyway to answer this question. I kind of chased my tail a bit, so I don't know how much I answered it substantively, hopefully enough to satisfy the questioner.
Well, and I get to apologize for taking the tangent this time.
No, it's a good tangent. I like your tangents. They're very clarifying. You think much more clear than me and speak much more coherently than me, so I appreciate your interventions.
Oh, you're just being humble.
No, it's true. It's always been that way. I was like that with Kukio, too. Whenever I talked with Kukio and another person, Kukio was always the one who had to re-explain something for me. Because invariably I would say something that was stupid or ass backwards, or I'd get my head on backwards, or something would happen and he'd have to kind of clarify it, and he always was able to.
Well, the ass is supposed to be on the backside, but yeah, I gotcha.
Oh. Case in point.
Got him.
Yeah, assistance is appreciated. And your insights are also welcome and respected.
Yeah, and then to go back to our point earlier about bias, I think Peterson is Canadian, which I would guess a Canadian would share a lot of the same American biases about communism and Russia being kind of a historic enemy. So that probably feeds into his perspective about Marxism to an extent, where he was once a young boy kind of growing up and being fed information the same way that anyone else has, and that's kind of the area of the world that he's coming from.
Yeah, it's quite possible. There are people who grow up with a certain bias against certain, well, again, like we were talking about before, North America, not just the U.S., has a cultural predisposition to dislike and distrust authoritarian, not only governments, but also ideologies. And generally, there's somewhat more tolerance for authoritarian ideologies on the extreme right and left wings. But in particular, for the right wing in Canada and the United States, there's a particular mistrust and dislike for authoritarian left-wing ideologies, and in communism in particular. At least because a lot of people in Canada, too, in particular, I think, had a lot of people, migrants, coming from the Ukraine. That kind of colored thinking to a degree in that period, kind of more early 20th century period, really. But in general, it may be that he has that background, so that may be more kind of the bias and perspective he's coming from. But in general, I try to stay away from assigning biases. Generally, I try to take people's perspectives at face value and give them the benefit of the doubt and try to analyze them accordingly. Judge the argument on its own merit, not based on who's making it, that kind of thing. I certainly have to do that because I'm not in a position to make appeal to authority arguments based on my own authority, because I don't have any. So let's see. Again, hopefully that's a satisfactory answer. If not, I apologize. Feel free to kind of elaborate on it and maybe come back to it. Well, I would be happy to come back to it if you did want to elaborate on it. Let's see. But the next question was, what effect did the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa have on Europe in general and Spain in particular? I honestly have no idea, because I've never heard of that before. I'm guessing Spanish Civil War, since you referenced Spain in particular, and it sounds like a Spanish name. But I don't know enough about the Spanish Civil War to really know... oh, I just Googled it. Definitely not the Spanish Civil War. Okay. Well, I don't know a lot about the Reconquista either. Yeah, July 1212. And it's a bit outside of my wheelhouse, unfortunately. Yeah, I know a little bit about the Reconquista. I know that was kind of a crusade. You know, generally when people think about the Crusades, they're thinking about the invasions of Jerusalem, Palestine, the Middle East, kind of that area. But there was actually another de facto crusade that was carried out by Spanish Christians to conquer Spain from the Moors. It was basically the Muslims that had conquered Spain in, what, 800 AD? Something in that range? Around there. Yeah, Spain had actually been effectively a Muslim country for several centuries, not long after the Roman Empire fell. And it wasn't until the Reconquista, in which Christians in Spain basically ejected the Muslim population, that it became, again, a purely Christian country. And partly that was done through the famous Inquisition, in which they systematically rooted out all heretics, as they called them. Yeah, the Reconquista Crusades were much more successful than the Crusades for Jerusalem. Yeah, Spain today is thoroughly Christian, so I'd say that went a lot better than the whole Jerusalem mission. And there was I think there was also nominally another de facto crusade kind of into Constantinople. I think that's the one that toppled the government there and replaced it with the Latin Byzantine Empire, which lasted, I think, 50 years or so. Didn't last long because people there hated them. It's kind of what happens when you're foreigners overthrowing a foreign government and putting yourself in power. The locals don't particularly appreciate it. But yeah, I'm not familiar with this specific battle, and I don't know enough about the specifics of the Reconquista campaign to kind of comment on it in any great depth. What effect? I'll have to remember that, though. Yeah, sorry, that's not a particularly satisfactory answer, but you know, one of the things I do like about coming on here is that I learn from chat, too. So I appreciate the interaction on that count. And then let's see. Next question was, but what about the foreign support Lenin received? I believe he was supported by the Brits. What did the Brits stand to gain? I've never heard anything about Lenin getting support from Britain. I think he did live in Britain for a while, but I don't think he was supported like by the British government. You know, certainly I don't think the British government would have anything to gain by supporting Lenin. Given that, well, I guess it depends on time period. If we're talking World War I, certainly there was no reason to want a radical ideologue inside Russia. You know, they wouldn't want to smuggle him into Russia so that he could overthrow the government. There would be no sense in that, especially given that the communist platform at the time was to pull Russia out of the war. You know, Britain very much wanted Russia to stay in the war, given that Russia and France didn't, well, not Russia, but given that Britain and France did not think that they would survive an onslaught by the total combined forces of the German military. So long as Russia was in the war, a good chunk of the German military was occupied in the east, and so they were not able to bring their full power to bear. That was thought at the time to be the only way that France and Britain could survive. So I don't think they would have much incentive to smuggle Lenin in. I think that was purely a German operation at the time. If you're talking before World War I don't think then either, because I don't think the British government had any particular love for radical leftists at the time. You know, Victorian Britain was known for its conservatism, and I don't think there was any love lost for radical actors, certainly radical Marxist actors of one sort or another. Now, I've never heard anything on this count as far as Britain supporting Lenin. So if they did, I haven't heard about it. And if they had anything to gain, I can't imagine what it would be. It would have to be something very weird and abstract. I know there was a rivalry between Britain and Russia in the late 19th century, the Great Game, so to speak, sort of that rivalry for South Asia, Central Asia. Kind of ended, though, kind of around 1900 or so, when Afghanistan was kind of agreed as the buffer state between them. But I don't think that competition was ever really taken so seriously as one state trying to really overthrow the other by manufacturing dissent or revolution in the other. You know, Britain's whole bag was kind of status quo stability. You know, big revolutions, big wars were kind of antithetical to their preferences. They wanted things to be quiet so that everybody could make money, specifically so they could make money. And that was more their principal interest. Now, World War I was kind of an accident in that sense. Nobody really wanted a huge-ass European war. It was just thought, in so much as people were for war, they were for it because they thought it would be over very quickly and would be relatively bloodless. Turns out that was a bad bet. But that was nominally the perspective at the time. Nobody really wanted to wreck European civilization with a huge-ass World War I. Certainly not with the Second World War. And that's kind of what they accidentally tripped into because of nationalism and secret alliances and, the whole... we've talked about the lead-up to World War I before. But so I'm not real sure what Britain would have gained by destabilizing the Russian government. I don't think Britain was so ambitious as to want to just take over Russia. And neither do I think they were so threatened by Russia and their potential for expansion to really want to do so. So, if somebody knows better, please contribute in chat. Again, I hate to sound like a broken record on that count, but yeah, again, I don't know anything about this particular issue that would suggest that Britain would have something to gain or would want to support Lenin, or has supported Lenin. This is the first I've heard of it. I'll stick that in my browser here so I can look into that later. Britain. Okay. Let's see. So the next question was, what do you think of rising interest rates and what areas will be most impacted? Yeah, this is kind of another black box. We don't really entirely know what's going to happen when interest rates substantively start rising. At least over time, substantially start to rise. Because they've been so low for so long. And, we're very much in a weird, unknown, unprecedented monetary environment right now as far as monetary policy. Like, monetary policy was never supposed to be this relaxed for this long. And so the effects of having it be so for so long are unknown. And so as a result, it's not entirely known what happens when you have such an environment and then suddenly introduce higher interest rates. That's why central bankers, rather, that's why central bankers are so reluctant to substantively increase interest rates all at once. They're doing it very incrementally, slowly over time, because they're afraid that if they do it too suddenly, then they'll collapse whatever weird equilibrium they don't know about that has set up as a result of this, 20, 30 years or so of relatively easy monetary policy, relatively low interest rates. So there's a great fear that they might set something off. But because nobody knows what's going on or what kind of monetary environment is in place now and how the overarching economy has been influenced by low interest rates over a long period of time, everybody is terrified that there's some monster that they're going to accidentally unleash by increasing interest rates too quickly. There's also a fear that things might explode if they don't raise interest rates. There is a logic that if interest rates stay too low, then eventually it's going to just start distorting the economy, if it hasn't already. There's already argumentation that that's what it's been doing. Some of the bubbles are said to be a manifestation of that. Basically, too much capital chasing too few returns, and in turn getting increasingly desperate and betting, basically gambling, on certain activities in the economy. So there is a logic then that interest rates should be raised to prevent distortions of that vein. And that if they don't, eventually they'll just create larger and larger bubbles that wreck the economy. But again, nobody really understands fully what structural changes in the economy, what changes in the monetary policy over the past 30 years have done to the economy. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about before and projecting how society responds to structural economic change. Generally, by the time you have enough data to understand the phenomenon, it's already too late to really influence it, and a new phenomena is kind of taking place. Similarly, in economics, it's really hard to understand how economies work before they start to change again. As soon as something new starts influencing an economy, you barely really started to understand it when it's kind of at the tail end of its run and is starting to be replaced by a new influence. So similarly now, we have a whole bevy of technological and structural changes to economies all over the world that are influencing just fundamentally the way economic actors interact with each other. And we just don't have the data to really analyze it. And if you don't have the data to analyze it and understand it, but you're still responsible as a central banker for modifying this very important variable that is important to determining the overall health of an economy, then you're kind of in a bind, because you don't want to wreck the economy, but without understanding how the economy works, you might very easily do it accidentally. So the thinking is, whatever we do, let's just do it slowly. So that's kind of the party line at this point as far as central banks goes. Central bankers are very much of the vein that, okay, maybe one central bank thinks interest rates should go up, maybe one thinks they should stay relatively low. Whatever they do, they're just going to do it very slowly because nobody really knows what's going on. That's a big area of uncertainty right now in monetary policy. As for what areas will be most impacted, pretty much anything that is tied to interest rates, like mortgages, car loans, student loans, loans of any kind, basically. All of those and the costs on interest are closely tied to overarching interest rates. So one thing that might happen, because some people have kind of talked on and on about a student loan bubble, one of the reasons that college costs have gone up so much is that so many people are going to college, and one of the reasons so many people are going to college now is because student loans are relatively cheap and have been for a long time. It might be if interest rates go up, especially if they go up a lot, it may be that that bubble bursts, if indeed it is a bubble. Whether it's a bubble or not, basically the demand for college would fall. Fewer people would be able to afford it, would want to take on those loans, and there would be less demand for college, and in turn college tuition would probably fall, which would not necessarily be a bad thing in and of itself, because that would make it cheaper for some people. But for those people who would be locked out of college, it would be a problem, because then they need some alternative mechanism through which to move up the social ladder, and it may be that there's not an alternative. In Europe, they do a better job with that because they have more technical schools there. And in the US, we don't really have that. So that could be a potentially big problem.
One thing that's also kind of an existential thing to bring up here is that a lot of times people kind of have the idea that everyone should go to college necessarily, which I don't think is correct for the range of human beings and how they operate, even for people who are kind of similar. So we have two examples that are really close to home. My brother did not go to university. He had the option and he chose not to. It did not interest him as something to do. And then Kukio's brother as well, college didn't really work out for him. He's more interested in trade school. So the format of college, where it's a place where you have different subjects that you may or may not actually specialize in for your job, for some people feels like a waste of time. Like, why am I taking this course if I'm not going to use this in work? They want more practical skills, which I think that's fine. If that's what you prefer, then you should do that. So the idea of university education is something that should be accessible for the people who want it, but I feel like to push everyone into that track doesn't really make sense for how humans work.
Yeah, that's a very fair criticism, and there's a lot of truth to that. But the overarching economic principle is that higher cost means less demand. And that means that there's going to be lower cost and fewer people going to college who might otherwise really want to. Maybe they can very easily go to a technical college and do just as well. But there are some people who would do well in a college with a college education who will not have that access. And that's more what I'm talking about. That's more the issue that would arise. But that is a good discussion to have. Technical education in the United States has been sorely lacking for a long time now. And it would be a lot better if people invested more in that. Speaking from my own experience, I went to a high school where the official school policy was to have every student graduate and go to college, which is the dumbest shit, because that's just not going to happen. There's a lot of kids that don't want to go, for one, and there's a lot of kids who don't want to go and don't need to go, who would be just as happy with the technical side of that type of education. So you're basically just shoveling people into universities who don't really need to be there and saddling them with debt they don't really need. That's not a great policy to have, I think. It looks great for the school, because the school gets awards and they get more money from the state if they can graduate a larger percentage of the class. So bureaucratically speaking, great policy. But in terms of actual educational outcomes and long-term life outcomes, not so great. It's not really a big picture type policy. So I don't recommend that. Let's see. So as far as what areas would be most impacted by it, so to kind of finish that thought, another possibility is that a collapse in student loan demand, if indeed there is a collapse. That's an if, not an inevitable. But if that did happen, that could be a big problem for a lot of banks that hold a lot of student debt. So that could precipitate a minor financial crisis, potentially a large financial crisis, if the balance sheets of banks are sufficiently gutted to push them near insolvency or into insolvency. So that could be a financial problem right there. Could be like another major bubble bursting. There's also, I've heard off and on about a car loan bubble, because supposedly there's a lot of subprime car loans going on. But I've also read that there's not a lot of substance to that. But that's a possibility anyway. That may or may not be an issue in the future. Those are kind of the two big ones that I remember reading about. And I don't follow economic news closely enough or business news closely enough. I need to work on that more. It's always a goal, and sometimes I do better than at other times. But for now, given what I remember, those are kind of the two. Those would be the principal issues from a significant interest rate rise. It would also be a problem if you're a developing country. That's another issue, because we actually talked about this last time. Interest rate rises correspond with increases in the value of a currency. Because in general, when an interest rate goes up, the rates on bonds go up. And so if the rate on a bond goes up, that makes it more attractive. And so you would want then to redistribute your portfolio to have more of those bonds that are now more valuable. So when interest rates go up, what happens is that people around the world, investors around the world, will take some of their money, pull it out of some investments, and put those investments into bonds in the country that raised interest rates. So when the US raises interest rates, generally developing markets lose money. Money is pulled out of investments in developing markets and invested in the US to take advantage of the new higher interest rate. Not all of the money is pulled out, it's just redistributed. So maybe instead of having 20% of your portfolio in developing markets, now you'll have 19%. And then 1% more in the US market to take advantage of the interest rate rise. That's not a exact example, that's just roughly what I'm talking about. It's not a massive flood, but it can be very large if you're a country really struggling to attract investment. Losing any amount of money can be damaging, and it can be especially problematic if your market has a lot of risk or is in a recession or something like that. In that case, you're going to lose disproportionately more money to that kind of redistribution. So an interest rate rise, a substantial interest rate rise, even if it's over time, would negatively impact developing markets. They can still grow, it won't necessarily be crippling, but it'll be a problem for them. It'll be a brake on their development. Let's see, and then what is your opinion on the future worldwide of potable water with a focus on its commercialization? Yeah, I haven't read a lot about environmental issues in terms of policy making, so I'm not as familiar with things like commercialization of water or renewable resources or etc. So that's not something I'm all that familiar with. The principal thing that I've read about with relation to water is water conflict and the potential for water conflict. But as far as potable water and commercialization, I haven't read as much. Hypothetically, it would be possible. The case study there would be something like Cape Town, or was it Cape Town? It's a city in South Africa that actually just ran out of water, basically. And I think it was Cape Town, if I'm remembering correctly. Chet can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Maybe we have somebody from South Africa listening. But the city is, the region the city's in is experiencing a drought. And the drought has gone on long enough that the city's water reservoirs have basically shrunk to negligible levels. And so they're at a point now where they have to engage in extreme water preservation policies, just to kind of make sure that there's even the barest minimum of water available for the population. And it's one of the first times that, at least in my memory, that a major city has had that kind of problem. Serious environmental crisis and public health crisis, because people need water. So there's a lot of talk about little things that people can do, recycling brown water, etc., that sort of thing. And I think there's articles on it online, about it that people can look into if they're interested. I think I posted a couple times about it on my Twitter feed. If you're interested, if anybody's interested in that.
That's a nice way of saying follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, that's a mild plug for you. Yeah, on Twitter there. Yeah, for the future of potable water, I think as the world's population is predicted to kind of trail off at about 8 billion or 10 billion. Actually, it's already almost 8 billion, isn't it? 7 billion now? Something like that. So I think it's more like 10 billion. So it's supposed to kind of asymptotically approach 10 billion or grow very little after 10 billion. And nominally, the logic is predicated on changing birth rates and changing demographic trends, etc. The pattern you see in developed countries is that birth rates tend to fall dramatically as the country gets wealthier. So it's expected that as countries develop over the next 100 years, that the rest of the world will experience a similar fall in birth rates, and that in turn will result in a total world population of around 10 billion or so, and that it'll just start to stagnate after that, basically. So water resources are already kind of stretched, so it's not entirely clear current water resources can handle 10 billion. But in so much as they can, it could be that commercialization proves to be the mechanism by which water and water abundant areas is transferred to water scarce areas in order to help those people, to give those people the water supplies they need. So water commercialization is viable. To a degree, it already happens, because there are some island countries that do not have enough water for their population who have to import it. And they actually have water tankers that will bring the water to the island. I think Cyprus is an example of that. Maybe Malta. One or the other anyway. Basically, that's a thing that happens. So there's already some commercialization of water. Whether or not it really takes off, whether or not you see it in other countries that have not traditionally had it, I think will depend on how scarce water becomes. You know, if it becomes really scarce, then yeah, it'll definitely be commercialized to some degree. Although that's also a political question. Some countries and polities will be more comfortable with privatization than others. Some will prefer a public solution. That's also viable. But it could be difficult if, you know, it's an international problem. You know, if you're a country as a whole that just doesn't have enough water, you know, it doesn't matter if you nationalize your water supply, you're still not going to have enough. So how then do you get more water? Well, you're probably going to have to go to the market, since it's unlikely that another country is just going to volunteer to send you a lot of water. And maybe that there's an international institution in future that is set up that is responsible for such water transfers, but that would require a lot of commitment, a lot of funding from other countries, and it's not clear that that kind of political will exists yet. But basically, this is a long-winded way of saying I don't know enough about this issue to really comment on it. So I apologize if that's not a particularly satisfactory answer. I guess it's really not. But that's the best I can kind of do. I don't know enough policy-wise as to the state of the current market for water and how far it's developed. And what I said before is about the most I could say as far as a prediction for how that would go. I would need to read more in order to kind of commit to a more tighter answer than that. So the next question was, could you enlighten me on what it was that made people hate Putin so much in the West? I don't think it was ever really any one thing, because I remember people actually kind of liked them for a while. Well, there are people who like them now, but those are more the populist sort of political forces in the West. It used to be, when I was in college, that there was some affinity for him on the political left, because he was seen as kind of standing up to the Bush administration. The left hated the President Bush. They hated him so much. That was kind of a running theme in that period. So there was some affinity for him on that count, just because he was standing up to the Bush, seen anyway as standing up to the Bush administration. I think the thing that kind of changed was there were two principal things I think that contributed to the deterioration and perceptions of Vladimir Putin. One of them was the Ukraine, which was widely perceived as basically Russia bullying a neighbor that it wanted in its sphere of influence. You know, the Russian government kind of has traditionally seen countries in its near abroad, so to speak, as a part of its sphere of influence, and resents other countries kind of taking action there. And so the actions taken following the Maidan revolt were seen as an example of bullying and an example of great power, influence, and coercion, and basically the same kind of behavior that the United States is traditionally accused of engaging in. So that hurt the Russian government's image a lot by itself. There's also a lot of people that think Russia was innocent on that, though. Steven Seagal is an example of that. Did you see that, Neuro?
No.
Steven Seagal met with Vladimir, I think it was Vladimir Putin, but there's actually a picture of them kind of hanging out, and Steven Seagal sort of talking about how, you know, Putin is misunderstood and the American empire is responsible for this, that, and the other, and all this kind of thing.
I'm just alarmed right now that does not surprise me. I didn't see that, but I think I'm more concerned that I'm unsurprised by this information than that you're presenting it to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a bit of a non sequitur. Those pop up in international relations sometime. It's kind of like when Dennis Rodman went to North Korea.
Yeah, okay. Here on Twitch we say that's a meme. That's just a meme.
Yeah.
How funny.
But yeah, the Ukraine issue damaged Russia's image in the West, because that was seen as kind of a bullying behavior on the part of Russia. Mm-hmm. Again, I know it's perceived differently in Russia. Russians have a very different perspective of the Ukrainian conflict and the Maidan revolt and whatnot, but this person is asking why Westerners why the perception of Russia among Westerners has deteriorated, and this is part of why. Their perception of Ukraine paints Russia very negatively. Another problem is the LGBT thing in Russia. The LGBT community is somewhat maligned in Russia. And so because LGBT communities have grown in political prominence in the West, their interests are taken more seriously, and as a result, because Russia does not take those interests seriously, they're seen as being somewhat backwards as a result. They're seen as being somewhat oppressive against the rights of the LGBT community in Russia. So that's another factor. There's another factor too, which I'm going to try to remember here. May not be able to. I had it on the tip. It was just on the tip of my tongue a minute ago. Ukraine, LGBT. It slips my mind. Oh, no, that's what it was. Okay, this is kind of a twofold thing. One, Russia had already been kind of supporting populist political movements in Europe for over the past 10 years. They kind of did a little bit at first, and it's kind of grown with time. And that's made European governments increasingly nervous. Here's the thing, it didn't really make them nervous, though, until populist parties started to really get power. And so there's a sense then that Russia is partly responsible for that, and that's made the European countries take Russia more seriously, and Russia's support for these political groups as more of a threat. Whereas before they saw it as kind of harmless. They had enough, European countries and leaders had faith that their political systems were strong enough to that they wouldn't have to worry about Russian support for this, that, or the other political party. They saw those as fringe parties that would never be able to pose any real threat politically. That would have no chance to really wield political power. And then, of course, the immigration crisis happened, the Eurozone crisis happened, and that started to change. And so there's a sense, on the one hand, that populist parties are responding to the Eurozone crisis and the immigration crisis, but there's also a suspicion that maybe they would not have been as successful as they have been if not for Russian support. So you can kind of make of that argument what you will. Some people agree with that, some don't. But there is a wide perception, that perception is widely held amongst European political elites, certainly, as well as large chunks of the public. And so there's a sense then that Russia is empowering radical political actors within Europe, if not also the United States. And that's deteriorated the relationship. But in the United States in particular, I don't think anybody really cared about Russia until Trump was elected. That was the real big thing in the United States. Because I remember distinctly in the 2012 presidential election, Mitt Romney was talking about how Russia was a strategic rival of the United States. And the Democrats actually panned him for that. They were saying that he was, engaging in Cold Warrior thinking, that it was outdated thinking, that it was antiquated. It was an antiquated view of world affairs. So there was a sense that Russia was not like a real rival of the United States. And that was why there was a sense that even amongst right-wingers in the United States, even amongst conservatives, that was true. Conservatives in general tend to think of Russia more as a rival than others, but there was a sense that Mitt Romney's comment was probably taking a bit too far. So the 2012 presidential election, that statement and the response to it kind of revealed the degree to which America did not take Russia seriously as a strategic threat. Whereas when Trump won election, that changed entirely. The whole ball game changed. Like the whole thing was changed. All of a sudden, Democrats believed that Russia was responsible for it. Not all Democrats do, but there's kind of a wide suspicion that there was some kind of collusion there, and that Russia went out of its way to support Trump as a radical political actor in order to kind of hurt American interest and damage the U.S. and this kind of thing. This is nominally the logic. And of course, conservatives were already predisposed to mistrust Russia, and the national security establishment has kind of given those people fuel by pointing out Russia's various attempts to influence U.S. politics to varying degrees. We've talked before about how those are probably not very effective attempts. But because Trump won the election against the odds, because he was not expected to win that election, there was kind of a search for a culprit, and Russia was partly to blame. Well, again, subjective partly there, but Russia was kind of had the finger pointed at it as a potential culprit as far as how Trump was able to win when he was expected not to. So those are all factors that have damaged Russia's image in the West. And I would highlight the Trump thing as being the principal reason in the United States, because the U.S. politicians and leaders hadn't really cared about the other factors so much. Ukraine. I know Russians think that the United States government really cares deeply about the Ukraine and went out of its way to overthrow the government, but I'm very skeptical about that. I'm I'm really much more of the mind that the United States government could not care less about the Ukraine. Certainly the American public could care less about it. The U.S. government has only engaged in the Ukraine in so much as Europe has asked it to, or in so much as it sees an opportunity to sell stuff. Beyond that, I don't think there's any wider conspiracy there. But that's a whole other discussion we could have. I recognize that there's a lot of divergence of opinion there, especially in Russia. So I'll kind of leave that to the side. But I will say this. The Trump thing is easily the biggest factor as far as the United States and the relations, faltering relations with Russia. Europe has its own problems with populists. That's probably more the issue there, but they were already kind of skeptical because of the Ukraine, especially Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltic states in particular, had a lot of, experienced a significant uptinge in Russophobia, if you want to call it that, because of the Ukrainian issue and the Russian response to it. There was a sense that Russia was becoming aggressive again in its relations to its neighbors, and that maybe the Baltic states and Poland were under threat. And so that, for them, was more the principal driver of the fall in relation. But Western Europe, it was more about populists, I think. So that's kind of a broad-ranging question there. Different countries basically have different factors that kind of drove that, but all of them kind of share them in common in varying degrees. Okay, that was the last question.
And that is just about perfect timing. Fuzzy Cord is not just someone who passively hands things along. He is aware of what is going on, and he's aware of the pace at which you're going through these questions, and he is aware of the time that we plan to stream on a given day. So, good job, Fuzzy Cord.
Well done, sir.
Yeah. Today was fun.
Yeah.
Appreciated
the
discussion. We got to range all around, even touching on some saucy stuff that people want to know about. Ooh, tell me the exciting things that are controversial. Please take a stab at them. No, we're trying to be neutral here. No, don't you want to take a stab at them? Well, good stuff. Next week I have DreamHack Austin, so we may be out of the loop for a while, but this is episode 29. It will be on YouTube probably very soon. I guess I still have to upload 28. We're a little bit behind, but if you want to see it right away, I'll highlight it tonight and it'll be on the Twitch channel. But thank you very much for coming on. Thanks for hanging out and giving us such awesome questions, and Fuzzy Cord for passing those to us. Good stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much for having time for me. Maybe next time we can get into the Sino-American trade negotiations. Those have been very colorful too.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Take care, Agent Smith. Thank you for being on.
Yep. Have a good night.
You too. Sweet. Sweet. Can you repost the site from your friend? What? What does that mean? The site from my friend?